Varda Walk, Psychological Adventure, Fantasy Slowburn LitRPG, complete. Chapter 87, Court. The next day, Yeseri told him he could start some light exercise with a warning not to overexert himself or he could take sickness, which is why he did his balance routine slowly, ignoring the ache of muscles fatigued from yesterday, and an hour later he completed his push-up routine at half the pace and double the struggle of a mere week prior. His shoulder throbbed mercilessly, while his collarbone insisted that it was made of knives. Once again, Ulrich found victory over himself and sat panting on the bed, a pale mockery of the glorious bed he'd had before its tragic demise in the attack. That soft, perfectly supportive mattress would be avenged. The stretching routine and stance work Ulrich decided to forego. He wasn't ready yet. Already the shaking of his body and twitches of muscles said that he'd gone too far. That was fine, he'd needed to see what he could do. Ulrich left his core alone, choosing not to expend any of that strength. He had a feeling that core saturation was doing heavy lifting at the moment. Without windows and in a state of mind that could only be described as questionable, Ulrich had no bearing on time other than that he was fed and treated twice daily. He'd been fed once, so it was still the 7th day following the assault on Iri Elhos. The 7th day since Baldar T had been, maybe, killed. Ulrich had received no word, no news regarding anything outside this room. Yeseri was surprisingly rigid on not giving Ulrich reason to be excited or disturbed. When you are released from this room, you may find out for yourself all that has happened outside of it, and not until, had been his final words on the matter. Absent any remaining stamina, absent any reasonable way to learn what transpired outside, and incapable of concentrating for very long on his mana without trying to touch it, Ulrich laid down for a nap. When he woke, Gaiat was sitting next to his bed in a chair that had not been there before he slept. He reacted as anyone would. Jerking from unexpected proximity, Ulrich's body twisted to stand. Clothing that he normally eschewed in bed tangled weirdly with the blankets and, in his weakness, caught him to send him spinning to the floor, netted thoroughly by his own bedding. It took longer than he would ever admit to a sentient soul to extract himself from his imprisonment. When he managed to climb to his feet, disheveled, he was greeted by the ghost of a smile and an upraised eyebrow from the most physically beautiful creature he'd ever seen. Beauty hid a lurking evil, a heart blacker by far than her acorn-brown satin hide would suggest. Gaiat Iriel, the taipan that put fear into any mortal that found itself in her envenomed path, was exactly who Ulrich did not want to see. Not for all her vivacious curves, accented as she sat in her chair primly, one leg crossed over the other to bounce lightly. Not for her midnight braid of finest silken hair. Ulrich realized that his thoughts were wandering again and that he'd spent longer than the correct amount of time noticing her breasts. Fuck. This was why he didn't want her around, at least partly. A man needed time to be ready to face that kind of thing, not have it sprung on him from out of nowhere. He had to find inner peace before she just appeared like that, and he was way too scrambled from his recovery to be exposed to those wondrous orbs unshielded, both the ones on her chest and the ones with which she leveled a piercing gaze on him. Briefly, Ulrich pondered whether or not the Morphinator had returned to take him away to Wonderland. Before he decided that he wasn't high, he was just really, really horny and kind of tired. And now that he thought about it a little, more than a little sad. He'd tried really hard not to think about this fey creature at any point in his recovery. The last time he'd spoken to this woman, he'd said some pretty awful things to her. Accurate things. Things she'd been unable to refute without resorting to an untruth. But still awful. He wasn't proud of it, though. Perhaps it had been necessary to force issues left too long under the table into daylight. He was a hammer, and sometimes the problem was a nail, but not always. Sometimes the best thing you can say is nothing, and that was what Ulrich decided he was going to do now. Instead of checking to see what the dirt here tasted like, freshly marinated between his toes, he settled himself down onto his bed to wait her out. What he wasn't prepared for was for her to square herself up, draw her knife and extend it towards him. She was about as relaxed as he'd ever seen her. "You may kill me now, Glade Chief, or you may have another do it at your leisure," she said smoothly. What? He must have said it out loud. His eyes took in the offered knife, not actually hers, but his own knife, which he had last seen buried in the mage's barrier just before the Seron blew him away. It was warped slightly and blackened, but still sharp. He looked up to hold her eyes, confused. I failed, Guyot answered simply. In the only task I had left to me, the only reason I had to continue to exist, I failed. When an enemy appeared while you were vulnerable, I was nowhere to be found. While I raged and pouted and wished you death to avoid having to do my duty, you were attacked and nearly were killed before you could destroy your attacker. And I did nothing to prevent it. Nothing. Shaking her head, she refused to meet his eyes any longer. Worse than nothing, really. You were found without your armor, without the Hellite weapon, either or both of which would have rendered you capable of defeating your enemy unscathed, because I arranged to have them left for Uncle Uldin to be able to examine, to stimulate him from his ennui. My selfishness actively pruned away your defenses, and then I left you to your enemies, who I knew were likely to be able to observe our movements from afar. It is as if I had been working for them. No better could my actions have served their purposes. His shadow stated bluntly. Not that Ulrich could ever censure her for that. It was his own fault. He made his choices. He'd been too bothered to think about the fact that he'd left behind all his weapons and protections. He'd been spoiled by how safe the fortress seemed. And he'd also sent Guyot away, too angry and bitter to consider that he might need her around. He'd forgotten that Varda punished mistakes. In any case, if she'd been in the room, it was damned good odds she'd have been incinerated. When he tried to object to remind her that it was his command to specifically be gone, she whipped the knife violently to the floor, burying its tip into the heartwood. I will not let you carry blame for this, Ulrich, she shouted at him. The elf girl was serious, every line of her said it. My own hand tied this knot. Guyot spat, angry, but not with him for a change. She was up now from her chair and pacing, stalking back and forth like a jungle cat, testing the limits of its enclosure while she raged more quietly. This is what I have been told by all who had love for me for weeks, and I was too stubborn, too coiled up in mine own ass to listen. Always they spoke words I did not want to accept. Every day Vedir yells into my ears, hate blinds the eyes and leads the feet astray. Hate is how the hunter loses the way. And every day I treat her words as mud to be stepped around, Guyot said reproachfully. Without a single change of inflection, she hit him with another surprise. You are a saw-toothed agony briar of a man, with a mind that creates bridges to nowhere for no purpose but to see the sky there. But you did not treat me unfairly, even when I had earned it. And I did hate you for being Valin, human, an injustice that should not exist between us. Not for one who has proven they not only hold no ill blood towards the Aesir, but also embraced the elves as they would their own kin, who placed themselves against their enemies and almost died for it. The woman raised her voice angrily, again, and he was glad not to be the target of her ire. Hear me now, Glade Chief. I have thought long on my failings these days past. I have listened as you screamed pain I allowed to be caused by an enemy made because you refused to stand aside and let my people suffer, Gert announced, her voice echoing in the auditorium. I am your shadow, now and forevermore. I am not Guyot Iriel. I am not a daughter of the elves or a huntress guarding their lands. I am a knife in your belt and a shield on your back. Nothing more to Iriel. Before he could say anything, before he could object, her own belt knife flashed, and her wonderfully complex tapestry of a braid fell to the floor. She looked like she might cry again, but the steel in her viridian eyes held tears away. Her knife blade shook, so unlike her normal control. A name is a thing of power, and my father told me true when he said that I did not value my own. Since I made it worthless, I will wear the one you have given me instead. I am Taipan now, a better fit for one such as myself, and a reminder to value that which is granted to you by loved ones. Taipan declared, immutable in this. Ulrich knew it in his bones, that if he looked at her status now, it would, from this moment on, read Taipan. She'd chosen to accept his name, had chosen to leave her old life behind. Ulrich might be a thick bastard, slow on the uptake, but he knew better than to attempt to countermand her. He was certain that if he tried to turn her away, now that she'd spill herself on the floor, Grief has a way of doing that to you. Sometimes it clouds when the hurting is all you can see. Frequently, though, it clears away the debris and makes a way through all the noise to show you what matters most. Taipan was proud, incredibly, utterly proud, not of her form, which she was aware of and which she found pleasure in, but of her will. She was proud of her commitment to serve her people. She was proud of her choices to neglect pomp and ceremony and the soft life of a doll at court to become a weapon for her kin. It was a blow to that pride to have dulled herself through arrogance, to have cast aside all of her efforts and become less by stubbornness. She had made herself useless, and that killed her inside. Now she found that throwing away the broken and corroded pride allowed her to become what she'd wanted to be again, a sharpened blade honed by purpose. Taipan was reforged. Just when he was certain he'd seen it all, she threw him another knuckleball. "I am sorry, Ulrich, for not being there to help. I am sorry that I deliberately tried to bring you discomfort above and beyond what is appropriate for comrades. And I am sorry that I tried to treat you as less, just because of your race. You are a good man, Ulrich, even if I do not understand you. Will you accept me, Glade Chief? You can still kill me if you want, though. No shadow should be allowed to behave as I have. A strapping is the least you owe me." Taipan spoke hesitantly, clearly expecting the worst. He'd considered beating her on a couple of occasions. Not that he thought he could mind, not without finding out if that little asterisk in his status meant his organs had like fucking glitter or something on them, or some Vardan mystical nonsense. He'd also considered spanking her, though that had a completely different connotation and was in a seedy black box in his brain marked repressed id, nothing to see here. More recently, he'd more than considered killing her. He'd been standing on the edge of a cliff to actually do it. Or, probably trying and failing and dying to her. But here and now, Ulrich found himself unable to muster that hostility. Bright Eyes' sister had poured her bitter, jaded heart out to him. He had a soft spot for women, especially ones that were hurting, and that apparently applied even to one that caused him so much aggravation, frustration, and outright enmity. It was a weakness his long-lost sister had exploited time and again, when she wanted him to do something she'd known he wouldn't like. Come on, Ulrich, not even a little strapping. Just a 1 or 5 strokes of the belt sort of thing. Clamping down on it, Ulrich decided that it was best to just move on. "It's fine," he told her, even though it hadn't been even a couple of minutes ago. Letting go, for him, was always the hardest part. But he had to. It would be good for the both of them not to hold grudges against a dead woman. "I don't need to beat you, and I won't kill you unless I warn you I will first. Welcome to the team, for real this time," he told her with resignation. A great part of the gloom left her then, a weight being shed. She looked way too happy about being a slave. Just when he'd thought himself free of her, had decided to cut her loose somehow before the fire and the what followed, the fierce Taipan had her coils around him again, tighter the binding squeeze for her, choosing the commitment herself no less. Worse, Ulrich couldn't even resist. Many things had changed in his rebirth, within and without. What had, unfortunately, not was that he remained a sucker for a pretty girl with sad eyes, especially when they were being directed at him like a gun emplacement's targeting laser. Maybe he was just a sucker generally, getting himself wrapped up in the problems of Fey folk on the basis of an exchange of favors, winter housing, and an inexplicable growing admiration for them, odd as they were. He didn't owe it to them, not anymore, certainly, given his involvement had just God's damned almost punched his ticket. Only he couldn't shed the feeling that the twisty-minded aliens of immaculate beauty, living in unity with the nature around them, were worth championing. Nothing he'd yet seen of men had suggested they were, that was for damned sure. Fuck, he was caught. They had him by the feels. Ulrich Einar didn't catch feels. What the fuck was wrong with him? Actually liking people now. Maybe souls get a little bent when they pull through the fabric of reality. He sighed, surrendering to the pressure of the Taipan's metaphorical weight around him, too tired to question it further. No point, Ulrich. Just accept your fate. He really wished the tiger in elf skin over there would stop looking at him like that. All smug contentment, bad enough he was coming around to the idea of having her joined to his hip. No need to rub it in that she'd had her way against his better judgment. Again. Chapter 88. Beware of breaking down walls. In the hundreds of imagined ways that this meeting with Taipan would go, this particular series of events was not even remotely on Ulrich's radar. He'd expected yelling, vehement denials from a sketchy perspective, and some pretty personal name-calling. None of that, though. She'd offered nothing but a mea culpa, to an extent that Ulrich would not have thought she owed. People make mistakes, and yeah, hers were pretty bad, all things considered. However, Ulrich had never once, in that entire nightmare of a week, blamed her for his being there. If you can't take responsibility for where your own 2 feet land you, you are a child, no matter your age. Clearly, Taipan didn't see things that way, and Ulrich chalked it up in the growing pile of oddities labeled elf shit. Personal tragedy, failure to live up to her own ideal of herself, failure to live up to her people's expectations, and above all, a deep and abiding pride that forbade her from continuing on, as she had forced her to either change or be destroyed. Like metal fresh from a forge, it either quenches true or warps. The steel in her was good. His eyes drifted magnetically to the intricate braid lying dead on the floor. He liked that braid. But he could see why it had to go. He almost smiled when a random thought flickered. Taking in Taipan, he held her emerald and bronze-flecked eyes and said, with as little inflection as he could possibly muster, "Just because I am bald, I do not expect you to also be bald." Her eyebrows drew up in confusion, then downwards angrily. Her lips parted to explain to him that that was not the purpose, before it caught up to her that he was joking. The thin line of her compressed lips, her narrowed gaze, now that was her mother Vedir all over. He couldn't stop the grin from sneaking across his face while her features flitted from one emotion to the next. "You have the grace of a crimson bull and the shame of a prosper spice merchant." She libeled him evenly. Now he had her back, there's her fighting spirit. Ulrich didn't think his reality could hold together if she didn't have that pepper to her. He did apologize, though. She wasn't wrong. "I apologize. It is a reflex born of almost crippling inability to deal with intimacy or empathic connections to people." He told her truthfully. She'd been honest with him after all. That seemed to catch her off guard. She had the cutest confused expressions, with that elegantly slim nose all scrunched up, thin eyebrows furrowed, and those lovely lips pursed like she'd bitten lemons. Sighing out her resignation, she bent down to pull his battered Forest Lord fang knife from the floor, telling him with her mother hen alto, "I had already learned this, Ulrich, but thank you for offering me trust. You must not tell other people about such weaknesses, Glade Chief. They would use this to manipulate you into compromising positions, to keep your balance uneven while they outflank you or set entrapments." As I did. Frequently. He took the offered knife, hiltless bone, like polished ivory in his hand, though it now sported blackenings down its length, and patted the flat of the blade into his hand a couple of times while he considered her advice coupled to a confession. It was sound, but he didn't need her to tell him not to reveal flaws in his personality. Ulrich was not what you might call an open person. More like a vault door with a self-destruct hidden inside its mechanisms. Ulrich tilted his chin to acknowledge her, though. "You got it, Taipan," he said, and that was sufficient to satisfy her. He didn't comment on the other bit. She'd clearly already reflected on it, and he was willing to let bygones be bygones if she had truly decided to try to be a better person. Holding grudges was a lot of work, and he'd prefer not to. A substantial divergence from his attitudes in the before. Here, he'd just rather kill the offender and move on with life. Also a divergence from the before. He endured a somewhat lengthy examination from her then. Was there fever? Where was the residual pain? Was he regaining flexibility and stamina? The sort of questioning he'd already lived through with Yesiri. He didn't interrupt her, though. His was the role of consummate patience. Eventually, she ran out of invasive questions. At the end of the interrogation, his shadow stared at him with a hawk's focus. "Strip," she ordered. Excuse me," he stuttered. "Strip. Remove your clothes. I would see you and know the extent of your recovery," Taipan commanded patiently, as if speaking to a slow cadet. Well, all right, I guess," Ulrich replied, slightly flustered. He wasn't sure why, though. He'd been naked around her plenty, and her him. Not a big deal. He undid the ties on the robe and pulled himself out of it, laying the plushy thing on the bedside. He wasn't as chilled anymore as he had been when he was missing about half his hide. He had to admit, perhaps his reluctance was that currently he made for a fairly comical sight. He'd lost the vast majority of his body hair, it had singed away to nothing, but that wasn't the rather amusing part. Ulrich was a three-tone zebra. Lashes of direct, deep burning flame, the surrounding flash burns, and the tragically rare, unburned flesh painted him in stripes and whorls. The regrown flesh was a bright pink, not yet having faded completely to his default lightly tan color. The secondary burns retained some hue from their angry red and were still moderately painful to the touch. His deep tan was mostly limited to parts of his face and sections of his torso and thigh that had been facing away from the blast. Taipan considered him without apparent emotion. After having him turn around a few times for her to examine him, she instructed him to re-robe. Ulrich was willing to admit he might have found her scrutiny entertaining under different circumstances. He could sense that the extent of the injuries was a sore spot for her, though, and declined to crack wise. She was trying, and his lingering misapprehension towards her was, while entirely warranted, not something he should allow to poison this attempt at a fresh start. The eternal gaze has truly blessed you, Glade Chief, in multiple ways, his shadow said without sarcasm, and Ulrich choked back a startled "What?" as she continued. Taipan told him, disbelieving, "When I found you, I did not think there was any hope, not after parts of you were coming away in my hands as I carried you to the healer's branch." Gross. He couldn't keep from grimacing at that image. Ulrich hid a breath of relief. For a second there, he'd thought she was making a double entendre. That would have been a little awkward. His mind flashed to the shadow that had blotted out light before he lost consciousness. There would have been more than a little irony to have expired in the shadow of his shadow, and he was glad Varda wasn't so poetic. Without your vitality and strength, you would have died immediately from such wounds. Without your optimized core, you would have succumbed quickly thereafter. I have a hard time believing that you still live, yet you are nearly recovered, his reformed tormentor declared. Ulrich was about to butt in that he didn't feel so damned recovered, but she ploughed on, bit between her teeth. I had wondered how it was that you managed to survive in the choking heaviness of the mana field found in the sacred grove. A field that dense would kill all but the hardiest, their bodies corroded by the excessive mana. Do not think the days spent on the plateau were easy on those who journeyed with you into your glade. We were all struggling under the weight of so much wild mana. This core saturation, it is miraculous. This past week I have learned of similar traits, in Sano adepts particularly, or in those with Tier 3 cores who have mastered mana manipulation to an unthinkable degree, such as Mother Bathe. To pull in the raw mana around you and feed it into your flesh is an incredibly potent trait. No wonder Yesri relocated you so soon. She shook her head at his cheating ways, her cut-off hair flying freely now. You know, Ulrich, this is the second time you have chosen not to kill me when you were justified, Taipan told him earnestly before quirking her mouth. Many would see this as a vulnerability to be exploited, especially vultures like lordling Morion that have reason to hold a grudge against me. There are not a few I have left without reason to see me harmed in some form or another. As you said to my uncle, I am a bloodthorn and everybody knows it. That has not changed, even if I will try to exclude you from my sharper inclinations, the tall woman told him, her hand going to her missing braid, fluttering around in the bobbed remains of her hair. Ulrich suddenly realized that she was being way too talkative. Far more than he was accustomed to, far beyond her usually reserved self. Far more, even, than her new outlook justified. Unable to hold the question, he blurted it out. Taipan, are you high? A widening of almond emeralds and a sudden refusal to meet his gaze answered for her. No way. Not once, not a single time, had Taipan showed any evidence of being anything less than at her full wits. Her armor had to remain impenetrable, adamantine against whatever perceived threat drove her to maintain her endless vigilance. So why now? And what was her flavor? As a recent convert to the glory of elven pharmacy, he was intensely curious about which substance should join the confounding nectar that had permitted him to come through the burn treatments sane in his pantheon of chemical bliss. After a minute of measured delay, trying to put her altered state of mind and the previous half-hour's behaviors into context, he decided that he didn't mind if she needed to be a little fucked up to face him. Under the circumstances, he'd have wanted to take a couple of shots of liquid courage to do the same. Taipan, I'm not angry. I just want to know if I've gone worms in the head, Ulrich said seriously, revealing his lack of judgment. Her eyes snapped back up, and he saw her teeth flash in a flicker of the rare smile she hid with the devotion of a monk. You have. Taipan giggled. Giggled? He really had lost his shit. But I am also high, she confirmed. I found the toadstool in your belongings, along with the medicinal herb that we used to deaden your ruined flesh. I did not think you would mind if I used it, since you were probably going to die, or I would. She admitted with greater certainty in that statement than Ulrich would have preferred. Forgive me my weakness, Glade Chief. I have been unable to sleep or find rest since the attack, and I was not sure I could keep my composure when you decided to kill me for failing you. Rather than shame myself further, I turned to the fruit of paradise. They are powerfully euphoric stimulants. I took one just before you woke. At first, it was merely calming, but now it is accelerating aggressively. Would you like to try one? They are technically yours. His shadow offered, pulling a tablet from one of her belt pouches. It looked like dry dog food, a pale brown pellet with a grainy texture. The potency of the foliage in your glade is beyond what I have encountered before, and I do not indulge in altered mind with frequency. This was beyond my expectation. I find I cannot guard my tongue as I would like. Do you see? Even now my words run freely. I should have stopped speaking at least 2 thoughts ago. Now 3. Oh no, it does not stop, Taipan exclaimed, becoming slightly panicked as she realized the depth of her inebriation. Ulrich found himself unable to withhold an amused cast to his head. At least her words weren't slurring. Good to know that her initial apology was mostly untainted. Casting his mind backwards through the conversation, he tried to pinpoint the moment when she started to really lose it, but the entire encounter was too outside his experience to place it. If pressed, though, he'd have bet she wouldn't have asked him to take off his clothes if she'd been completely sober. Actually, unless he missed his guess, the lass was well on her way to being proper blasted. Reaching for the pellet of righteous goodness, Ulrich took it from her outstretched fingers delicately. He wasn't sure how wise it was to be getting smashed on Glade Coke. He was, after all, freshly indisposed from life-threatening injuries and a devastating tragedy, which, on further inspection, was maybe the perfect time to call fuck-its and get hammered. Down the hatch. The pellet tasted like dog food, or maybe like dried cow vomit, he wasn't sure, not having tried either, but being nevertheless convinced the truth was somewhere between them. He realized at that moment that he hadn't been eating very much in this last week. Just small quantities of tasteless gruel, mostly. His system hadn't been able to tolerate much more than that. Uh-oh. If Taipan was any indication, he was on the clock now. Well-reasoned thought was going to be in short supply in about 30 minutes if he was lucky. I'm not sure if now is the time for a status update, but I have just realized that I may not have long before I join you in the wild ride. Can you tell me, Taipan, what has transpired since my wounding? You spoke to me just after, but I want to know what's happened after, and Doc Yesiri won't tell me anything, Ulrich asked. Her flighty expression dimmed, but she did not break, and soon she was sunny again. I will not tell you anything until healer Yesri has granted you permission to leave this place, Glade Chief. He was explicit about this. You are not to be given undue stress. I judge it enough stimulation to have offered you my life this afternoon. Any more, and you might grow too disturbed to be able to find rest. You need rest still, Ulrich. Your wounds are well on the way to mending, but pressing too hard will retard their full recovery. My responsibility to see you taken care of is not held lightly anymore, Ulrich. I am going to prove myself. You should eat more, though. You have lost weight. Your rump was flatter than normal. I should eat too, even if my bottom is not flat. We both should eat. I will get food, babbled Taipan. Rising abruptly, the elf woman stood and started to stride away. In the typical fashion of one who makes the mistake of being in a sitting position while making the transition away from sobriety, she tripped and fell immediately. Clambering to her feet and patting herself off, like a cat that refuses to acknowledge when it has displayed a lack of grace, the proud elf resumed a more studied amble up the auditorium stairs in pursuit of grub. That had to be one of the most ridiculous transformations of a person that Ulrich had ever witnessed. Was she always like that amongst friends? He considered what little he actually knew of this conundrum, wrapped in a riddle and dipped in broken glass. Not much, he realized. Everything he'd learned, both by association and in reference from her little brother, father, and others, said she was an overproud, single-minded devotee of the Iriellan warrior cult, obsessed with her vendetta to the point of rejecting most of the rest of her people's usual norms, while also being an abject pain in the arse. The only time he'd seen any reason to think otherwise of her was the fondness of Bright Eyes for his sister and her behavior back in Smith Ulden's workshop abode. It was possible she didn't know herself, so wrapped up in all of the rest had she been. Tunnel vision was a hell of a thing. So was obsession. The two went hand in hand to hide a person from themselves. Personal experience, that one. He'd earned that little nugget from dying. Wacky. Ulrich wasn't sure when, but he realized that he didn't feel any of the remaining burns. His body was sort of floaty, but not with the detachment of the earlier drugs. In fact, his mind was considerably sharper, better focused than it had been since he'd been charbroiled. Holy shit, that was some aces stuff Taipan had brought. He laughed briefly, noticing that his shoulder and ribs didn't even twinge. The lingering tiredness from his forced exercise was gone. Yeppers. Ulrich was going to start exporting Glade cocaine, if there were enough people still alive after the war to sell it to, which reminded him he needed to figure out who sent the assholes who'd attacked Irielhos and introduce them to his lightning javelin. Even that brief flash of morbidity couldn't penetrate his artificially heightened mood. Euphoric indeed, he was definitely coming under the influence. He stood up from his bed, learning from the mistakes of his, normally, effortlessly graceful Taipan. Ulrich wobbled briefly before his brain recalibrated to this new reality, and he stabilized. He still had it. Hard drugs had mostly been a thing of his 20s. Graduate school did that to you. There had been a brief period when he'd flirted with a few compounds designed to accelerate the mental acuities and attention, but those had been too harsh on their come-down for his liking. Intense psychedelics had proven too wild and disorienting. His trips normally ended up in some variation of him in a bathtub full of cooling water, wondering why the heat death of the universe was taking so long. Molly made him too fucking hot. Later on, of course, had come the booze of which he had certainly made a detrimental habit. This hit a nice spot for him. Now he understood Taipan's runaway mouth. His brain refused to stop rolling, one thing leading always to another. He relived his entire life since reforging in the 20 or so minutes in which his shadow was gone. Waking up naked, charging the Giga Bear, scratching his way up the proto-human tech tree, meeting Bright Eyes, journeying to Iriel with the lad, meeting Taipan, beating Taipan, his first night in Iriel, shenanigans with Baldart and the Iriels, days spent training and learning with the elves, a duel at dinner, his return to the glade, and the tragedy that shortly followed thereafter. It had been some 10 months, not even a year. If all the seasons were as proportionally long as winter, then around half a Vardan year. Oh hell, it just hit him. These people were all way older than he thought. Earth years were 12 months. Vardan years were more like 20 months. Holy fuck. So, mental maths, Taipan was 137 years old by 20 months over 12 months, which meant she was more like, 228 and change. Sweet Watcher's tits. She was fucking ancient. When the door to the Arcaneum Hall opened, Taipan the Elder came bearing gifts of the cornucopia. A dish of some grilled meat, real appropriate there, lady and sauced vegetables was cradled in one arm, the other holding a bowl of jam fruit and some blueberry-looking little apples. On her head was balanced a jug of some liquid. She sashayed down the stairs at near the speed of Ulrich's full-speed walk, not a drop spilling, in an act of coordination that defied reason. He really had not given Taipan enough credit for what a marvel she was. To do that while completely blitzed was a miracle of equilibrium. She reached the bedside and Ulrich took the dish containing the main course, a small side table which recently had been occupied by a bucket containing ragged strips of silk with dangling bloody bits of him, now held dinner. The first real meal since Captain Firecracker had ruined his shit. "Thank you, Taipan, for grabbing food. It smells great. You really should have told me how old you were when we first met, though, even though you didn't have any way to know," Ulrich said nonsensically. "Ulrich, what fresh madness is coming from your mouth?" she asked, which he deserved. He explained to her the difference in their planet's orbits and the resulting age discrepancy. She was quicker on the uptake than he was. "Oh, that is why your status reads 2 ages. Ulrich, you are much younger than you appear, you deceiving Valen, you." She poked him in the shoulder repeatedly as she delivered this statement with uncharacteristic mirth. She was right. He quickly brought up his status and saw that the age had actually reverted to show only a single number, the lesser one. The fuck? It changed because he realized the one and the other were equivalent and the unnecessary information got pruned. Fucking Akashic goofiness. Ulrich was 27 years old. He was actually younger than Bright Eyes. Wait, did that make Hallett a pervert? No, Ulrich, do not even go down that road. Different species, different rules. You are a grown-ass human adult. Taipan diverted him effectively, pulling 2 sporks out of a belt pouch and handing one of them to him before starting to eat out of the pan containing the grilled dish. Ulrich asked her where the plates were, and she promptly informed him that she forgot them, and she wasn't going back for them either, so he could join her or watch her eat. Which was fair, really. They cleaned the table rapidly. Had food ever been this good before? He sat on his bed, his pale imitation of what true beds were, satisfied. A full body buzz lit him. The dense mana felt like a warm blanket, comforting. This last 7 days had been unthinkably unpleasant. But just now, all was good. He locked away any consideration of the future. That demon would be slain when it arrived. An itch down the back of his neck made him turn to see Taipan, who was scrutinizing him intensely. Frowning, he checked himself for spilled sauce, or blood, or something. Abruptly, her predatory observation was curtailed. "What's up?" Ulrich asked. She sighed sadly, her hand waving back and forth to underline the tragedy. "I owe Hallett a sword from Uncle Uldin," Taipan said, her tone heavy with regret. "Oh, wow, that's smart. What did you do?" he inquired, curious about how they knew each other. He was ruminating on that cheerful elf's words of wisdom, which had implied that she had known Taipan well. His meandering was destroyed by a flash of movement. Ulrich barely tracked the missile of elven beauty that hit him. Her face pressed against his, lips warm, her scent poured into his nostrils, and 8 hands ran over him while he lost track of most of the rest of the universe. He couldn't feel her weight on top of him, even if he felt most of the rest of her, and gods, what a feeling. He was trying to figure out how elven belts worked when she shrugged out of her coat, somehow without breaking contact with his mouth. She was wearing nothing underneath, and his hands were lifted to the glories that rivaled the gods. They were everything he thought they would be. The auditorium door cracked open, healer Yesri, investigating a wild claim from his lover and compatriot Grenda, entered the heavy mana of the Arcaneum's sanctum with heavy skepticism. Surely not. It was unthinkable. As his eyes scanned for the impossible source of the noise he'd heard outside, he froze, eyes wide. They should not be doing that. Yesri was a little impressed. The man had been mostly dead not long ago. Sounds carried clearly from the stage below, and he heard easily the impressive range of his liege's daughter, who was clearly in charge down there. Yesri backed out slowly, trying to avoid catching attention, even though, he would later admit, he was certain that he could have marched a procession through the auditorium, and they would not have been noticed. He nodded, allowing himself a small bit of pride. He'd done his finest work on a near-hopeless case, and his services here were, unquestionably, no longer needed. Chapter 89. For every high a low. Ulrich woke first. Consciousness returned with immediacy, nigh on urgency. He couldn't quite remember why until he felt the sensation of soft skin against his, and a gentle rise and fall of breath that wasn't his reminded him. So, not a dream after all, not a fantasy or a final gift of heaven just before he snuffed out. Tentatively, just in case the perfection of form next to him was made of smoke, and this was all an illusion of some sick, sick mind, he let his hands explore. No, this was all too real. Firm over here, defined muscle, soft over here, a lush bit of padding over top of the iron beneath. And here, true softness. No fucking way, old man, you're in a simulation, Ulrich told himself with certainty. You're a brain in a jar. This was all some kind of computer-generated landscape designed to train AI, and someone is monkeying with the dials for their own cruel amusement. Just to spite whatever monster was watching, Ulrich decided he was going to enjoy himself to the fullest, and their predictive models for his behavior be damned. Wait, Ulrich, what are you doing? It is first thing, at least wake me before you start. Complained the illusion, though not with any ire. She was so real, though, so immediate. What if, by some chance, he wasn't in a simulation? Ulrich wasn't quite ready to admit that this was real life. It definitely needed more testing. Roaming touches elicited correct auditory responses, and he observed the quickening of specific anatomy that was indicative of a very sophisticated physiological modeling, fraught with pertinent details. His fingers drummed lightly, and he felt the simulacrum's hands grab his, its eyes open now and staring hungrily at him. Very well, Glade Chief, but just remember that it was you who started this, and I am not responsible if you delay your recovery, proclaimed the lilting voice. Just what a simulation would say, Ulrich thought, as she pulled him on top of her and tried to strangle him with her mouth. The pair of them finally managed to achieve clothed status. If it wasn't one, it was the other. He was now aware that Taipan found his morning warm-up routine, which was almost always done nude, absolutely enthralling. She learned that if she wanted to wear underpants, she was going to very nearly have to put them on while he wasn't watching. Ulrich asked her when she'd managed to remove said pants the day before, and she admitted shamelessly that she hadn't been wearing any the entire time. Commando. The elf girl commando going commando. Concentrate, Einar, you baboon. She's talking now. I fully expected you to choose to take my life, Glade Chief. When you chose to do so, I was going to seduce you and kill myself afterwards, and pants seemed like a small detail at that time. I'll admit, I only really brought them in my pack so that you could grant me some final dignity after all was said and done. Taipan explained, her ears reddening slightly. Hell's bells. Just when he thought he had her pegged, she came up with a new surprise. Oh, so, just so we're clear, that's not still the plan, right? Ulrich checked. No, Ulrich, that is no longer the plan, she confirmed, more than a bit cheerfully. Good. Good. If she'd had him and then offed herself, in addition to the tragedy of that situation, great enough on its own merits, mind you, Ulrich was absolutely sure that his self-esteem would never recover from that mortal blow. He'd more or less have her blood on his hands to the end of his days. Fuck, what a thought, he noted to himself. He recalled a thing she'd said just before things had gone, so wonderfully literally, tits up. You owe Hallett a sword from your uncle, eh? He grinned. What was the bet? She bet that inside of spring's first flowers, I would have taken you to my bed, Taipan said without embarrassment. If I did, I would owe her a commission from Uncle Uldeen out of my own holdings. And what did you bet? Ulrich prompted with some smugness. I bet that, within the same span, I would have murdered you out in the deep wood and hidden your body so effectively that all would believe you had run away of your own volition. Then she would owe me a new quiver, enchanted with perpetually fresh, three-step spider venom for my arrows, she replied, also without embarrassment. Oh, Ulrich said, all smugness vanished. It was a thing to keep in mind, Ulrich told himself. Taipan was still Taipan. He was very certain that had not changed. Damn, Ulrich blurted out. I said I wouldn't bed you, now I'm a horse's ass. Taipan shook her head, though correcting him promptly. You did not bed me, Ulrich. I bedded you. There is a difference. She seemed oddly insistent about that point, and he wasn't going to argue it. But she continued anyway. And besides, you told that to Gaiat Iriel, and that person is dead and gone. You have made no such promise to Taipan, and, if you know what is good for you, you will not say something so foolish. Ulrich was a guy who liked structure in his life. Boundaries, clearly defined limits on relationships, which was why he didn't mind it that his shadow had more or less threatened him if he vetoed sleeping with her. Her level green eyes, flecks of burnished bronze shimmering in the dim light, were completely without humor, so Ulrich knew not to push her on this. Not that he minded the current situation. He grunted his assent before looking around. He felt like he was missing something. Wasn't there supposed to be something happening? Oh, the doctor. Hey, where's Doc Yesari? I was so distracted I forgot he was supposed to stop by for treatments. Ulrich asked Taipan. She tilted her chin in that way she had of indicating that he was being slow. He came to check in yesterday while we made love. He left. You did not notice? She asked with skepticism. Ulrich chewed air for a few seconds. What do you mean he came in? Like, into this auditorium came in? You know, while we were, busy. Why didn't you say anything? Ulrich demanded. Now she definitely thought he was slow, because it would not have changed anything. Are you saying that you would have stopped if you'd noticed? She said with a slight barb on her question. That is a trap, Ulrich Einar. You were not saying that. Don't you dare say that. Of course not. I was just surprised that I did not notice that you noticed, he said quickly, hoping to remove the springs from this particular catch. She smiled then, and he inwardly sighed his relief. He was discreet and left immediately, and you were being enthusiastic about keeping me occupied. Delightfully occupied. Her tone increased the temperature in the cool hall by about 5 degrees. He couldn't keep an idiot grin off his face at the memory. Yeah, you were pretty awesome, he told her without shame. Ulrich realized that they were being like a couple of teenagers on their first romp. In Ulrich's defense, he'd long ago made clear that this elf woman was a manifestation of perfect female form to him. Her response, though, was something of a mystery. Taipan's own assertiveness had been a bit of a shock, but Ulrich was starting to get the feeling that that was just how elves rolled. She was definitely more open with him, like she'd shed a layer of the usual armor she'd kept over her emotions. Sitting here like this, the atmosphere was lighter, easier to breathe. If he was being honest, it made her a little more like her father, and just a little less like her mother. Which was going to be disturbing if he invested too much examination into it, because she already shared far too much physical similarity with the Elf King, and Ulrich was going to creep himself out. Ah, damn. He'd made himself sad, thinking about Bold-ET. Now that it had come to him, he needed to know. He couldn't just sit here and pretend nothing was wrong out there. Hey, Taipan, I'm sorry to ruin the good vibe, but I gotta know, how is your dad? He asked, his voice heavy with concern. Her mood fell, plummeted really, and she scrubbed her hand through her abbreviated hair, still unused to the absence of her long braid. He didn't rush her, giving her whatever time she needed. Minutes passed. Ulrich tried to imagine how he'd have felt if it was his old man, but couldn't. Not truly. The old geezer had never even had a colonoscopy, and his mam had promised to have him buried alive if he didn't hurry up and start dying. He missed them both fiercely at times like this. For Taipan, all he could do was wait and do whatever he could to help. He lives. Barely. Shore, bathe, and my dam return to Irielhos in time to halt the bane from corrupting him completely, and they continue even now to try to prevent its effects from deteriorating further, she told him, voice leaden with despair. What do you know, Ulrich, of bane poisons? She asked, still despairing. About her question he knew nothing, and he told her so. She paused for a moment to collect herself before she was ready to discuss it. Bane poisons are unique. They are targeted towards a specific race, and towards the members of that race are ultimately lethal. They do nothing to any other living creature. The odds of survival against a bane are so close to zero that I don't know of any elf that has ever truly escaped death from it. The poison infiltrates the flesh and blood, then it enters the core and infects the victim's mana itself. She said, hate for those who had used this against her father radiating off her. But Ulrich didn't get it. How was that different than any other poison? Hell, she'd poisoned him the first time they'd met, and he had a feeling he was missing something. Something that separated this bane from a regular poison. All right, so tell me why this bane is so much worse than, say, the striped bark snake venom you were using, Ulrich prompted. Because, worse than the immediate influence of the poison on its victim, it turns the body of the target into a poison of equal potency to itself. A single drop, smaller than the eye can see, is sufficient to begin the corruption, turning blood and mana to poison inside the body, rotting it from the inside out. When banes are used, they must be eradicated completely, the very ground scrubbed and buried deeply, far away, to prevent continued infection. Their use is a declaration of intent to commit genocide and violate the accords of war between any and every species, Ulrich, she said gravely. He was stunned. That was horrific. It was a level of awfulness that he found hard to imagine, as if contaminating wells with mercury or something. Worse, it was almost like nuclear weaponry in a way. It destroyed when it was used, and then it just kept destroying, over and over, tainting the land. Taipan saw his shock and was convinced that her honor saw the depth of the menace that was the bane. To ensure he understood, she told him of the even greater sin, which was the creation of this atrocity. It was a better world before she told him. Race banes do not exist in nature, Ulrich. Taipan began slowly. They must be manufactured, and their ingredients are the bodies of the members of the race for which the bane is being created. Her features grew menacing as she spoke. Muted rage twisted in intense loathing as she described this fresh horror. The process is simple: torture a person until, in their insanity, their hatred for their own existence grows so great that it warps their core, turning their own mana into a destructive force to end them. Then that tortured core is refined into a liquid with various alchemical agents, and once purified, you have obtained your bane. The challenge is in that most do not live long enough through the torture to become corrupted. Most die long before they can be rendered. On average, it takes 1,000 victims to produce a single bane core. The stronger the person was before they broke, the greater the concentration of the resulting bane. Ulrich's instinctive response was total annihilation. Whoever would do this did not get to live. He would not allow it, not on his world. The instinctive humming violence that had been sleeping soundly in his skull was awake at this existential threat. He realized that his fist was shaking. They had done this thing to Boldart, to someone who had offered him kindness, to a man who lived for his people and the happiness of his children. Unverzeihlich, he whispered. Is there anything I can do, Taipan? Anything at all? Ulrich offered. She shook her head slowly, trying to remain calm. There is nothing that I know of. The problem is that the corruption must be rooted out, all of it, at a scale so infinitesimal that it defies imagination. No amount of medicine removes it, and even though you can heal the flesh and blood, it just continues turning the body to more of itself. Great as they are, unparalleled within their own domains of skill, even my mothers have limits in the face of bane. Ulrich sighed, thinking about the awfulness of this toxin. In many ways, it was similar to heavy metal poisoning, but worse. The stuff collects in the fish, kills the fish. Then another fish eats that fish, and once enough collects, kills that fish. Then it kills the human that eats that fish. Then it gets into the soil and sits around waiting to kill another. Back in the centuries below, when humanity hid beneath the ground, metal poisoning was a disaster that had nearly wiped out colonies in which the particular elements were common. They'd had to, eventually, chelate their drinking and agricultural water, just as a matter of course. Wait, chelation? Binding agents? Taipan, how do you find the areas that have been contaminated by those infected by the bane? He asked cautiously, not wanting to become hopeful. She quirked her eyes. It is an easy spell, Ulrich, to identify. All bane are identical, no matter what individual is used. The result is the same. Only the concentration, the end amount, varies. It is a simple thing to recognize the precise location of bane. If it weren't, most of Orlithrum would have already been eradicated. There was a mass attack some 5,000 years ago. Those people do not exist anymore. Taipan said, the edge on her voice clearly indicating her preference for the current people responsible for her father's state. He had an idea forming. If you could find it, maybe you could bind it. If you can pin it down, maybe you can then remove it. Are there any metallic compounds that are capable of bonding to bane? he asked. He needed it to have a metallic component. That was the only way his plan worked, mostly because that was how it worked back on Earth. An organometallic chelator, a metal binding agent, sequestered the heavy metal atoms and allowed the body to then process them. I do not know. I don't know why you ask either. What are you plotting, Ulrich? She asked seriously. Ulrich told her reluctantly he did not want to feed her false hope, but nor did he want to withhold an idea that might save her father, and, perhaps, who knew how many others down the road. There was a thing very similar to what you describe back on my homeworld, only it happened naturally, on occasion. A substance could accumulate silently in the body, causing sickness and death. That body would then also be poisonous and taint the ground in which it was placed, which could then re-enter another person. We had a way to deal with it, but it required a substance that would be introduced that specifically binds to the poison. Binds to it so that you can induce the poison to be able to be extracted from the body. I think I can do something similar if there exists a compound, or magic, that will bind to the bane. At least, that would stop the decay. He finished outlining his theory. Taipan stood aggressively, grabbing his hand and hauling him up the stairs at a rapid walk. He was too surprised to resist, and only just kept from tripping as she drew him along. Ulrich felt the vague chafing of his nearly healed burns, but ignored the discomfort. It hadn't stopped him from having fun, and it wouldn't stop him from helping a maybe friend. He must be onto something, or she wouldn't have responded so. He had no idea where she was going, but let himself be led. Instead of complaining about useless things and being rendered unconscious so she could just pack him, which is what he was convinced would happen, he spent his energy trying to refine the budding idea. It sounded insane to him. But then all magic was slightly insane to him. Chapter 90. The Bane. The problem with this harebrained idea was that he had no idea if it would work. He wasn't a doctor, he wasn't a chemist. He only knew that chelation therapy had saved his great-great-grandmother, and his grandmother, bless her iron heart, had told the story every New Year's holiday. She was a great believer in declaring the gratitudes of the past on New Year's was his gran, even if they had been covered at length ad nauseum for the last half-century. It existed, and he knew the basic mechanics of the procedure from his education, but that was like saying that you know how gravity and fluid dynamics of moving gases works, so let's make a plane. Details matter. Taipan marched the two of them out into the hall and down a stair he'd never used before. They weren't leaving the Arcaneum. The stair spiraled gently, way too large a radius to be doing anything but going round the trunk of the heartwood pillar onto which Irielhos was built, or grafted, or grown, however you want to think about it. Ulrich noticed that the mana density, much decreased outside the amphitheatre of the inner Arcaneum, was growing again. The pressure on his skin grew heavier with every turn of the stair, and they simply did not end. He was certain they had descended some 20 flights. His stamina was still recovering, his legs burned with the extended climb down into what had to be the very roots of the great tree. The air was leaden now with wild mana. They had surpassed even the plateau's ambient field. Taipan, where the hell are we going? Ulrich asked, unable to restrain his curiosity any longer. She didn't turn, but kept a hold of his hand and continued their descent as she answered. We are taking you to see my mothers and the healers. I do not know enough of what you speak to understand if it can help father, but that does not mean that they don't. Perhaps Shaw will see a connection between your homeland's technique and the Bane, and will be able to utilize the knowledge. She paused in her speech momentarily, as if debating with herself. By the way her shoulders squared, she made an assessment. You asked if there is anything you can do, and I believe there is, which is why I am taking you to a place of which you may never speak, which you will, even if you must commit the sin of untruth, hide from the knowledge of any not in this place we are about to go. I am serious, Ulrich. You will be killed if you reveal this location. To even speak of the door we entered above is reason enough to banish you. None who are not members of Father's inner ring have ever been here, or know that this place is more than a myth. I should not even know about it, but there was no greater target to practice true stealth on than Father, so I heard things that were beyond my station. The graceful woman told him, as serious as she had ever been. I am assuming a place like this would not be unguarded. Do they know we're coming? Ulrich asked. Seemed like a good thing to know. If the Iriellen were protecting an ultimate secret, showing up unannounced was a good way to get arrows in you. They do not, Glade Chief, which is why I am going first. They are less likely to shoot me out of hand, but a human, any human, would be killed before announcing themselves. Taipan clarified solemnly. Good thing he'd checked. Ulrich felt like he was a fairly egalitarian dude, but something felt slightly off about hiding behind her, just in case they started taking fire from antsy guards. It was what she wanted, though, so he didn't complain. Or so he told himself. He still wanted to complain. What really stopped him was that his bitching would have been not only pointless, but also humiliating. Currently, thanks to his weakened condition, Taipan was strong enough to just manhandle him if he got out of line. Following with forced docility, and not a little unease, Ulrich observed the surrounding passage, and they continued their wide, downward spiral. The corridor had changed drastically, if so gradually as to be abrupt, when one noticed the contrast between the smooth, clearly civilized hand that had made the entry way far above and the natural texture of the living flesh of the heartwood. Similarly, the stair below his feet had transitioned from smooth, even planks to this grainy oaken texture of rough timber, as though the tree had created this passage intentionally for the elves. And maybe it had. Magic. Woo! Ulrich hummed to himself in a spooky voice. The air was heavy now, not only with magical force, but also with humidity. They had carried no light source with them, yet the corridor was lit evenly, a green-gold light that permeated the passage. Ulrich saw clearly now growths of fungi, lichen and moss that were creeping up the walls of the natural corridor, though they shied away from the stair itself. These clinging plants were the source of the light. In bulk, they produced a soft, prominent glow. Surreal, the climb had become something out of a true fairy tale. They were entering the realm of the Fae now, the domain of Titania and Erlenkönig. Upon the next turn, the corridor leveled out, stairs, like two conveniently shaped roots, become flat if textured floor. This hallway was 50 meters long and lit dimly with that same soft light. Those same mosses and fungi were now larger, with ferns and vines accompanying growing from every surface of the round tunnel, the ceiling included. You know when you're deep underground, there is a feeling of pressure, of the weight of the stone above. Ulrich felt that, but magnified. It was as if his presence was known by the great tree, and it could choose to simply close itself off, erasing this space and all within it. He wasn't sure if that was the influence of the incredible mana field, denser than anything he'd ever felt. His core could nigh unto taste the unearthly weave of Sano, life mana, Daendro, tree mana, Terra, earth mana, Aquae, water mana, and Germen, growth or plant mana. It was unlike anything he'd ever felt before. He looked at his shadow in amazement to see how she was responding to this astronomically sublime mana field, but was disappointed. She appeared not to even notice. That wasn't possible, Ulrich told himself. Maybe this was another case of Ulrich being a virtual child, so naive to the miracles of this world. What Taipan did notice was that their appearance in the corridor had not gone unnoticed by the score of royal guards at the other end, each with their weapons at ready in front of a round metallic door of that same bluish metal as his trident had been composed. Smith Uldin had called it Magbane adamant, or more formally, Ectalis Atzal, the unweaving metal. It had the distinctive property of destroying spell forms with which it contacted. Natural mana it did not affect. Mana shaped and manipulated into a spell it destroyed, making it a fantastic material for spellbreakers and anti-mages. Hence its more common moniker as Magebane Adamant. A door made of it was virtually impenetrable to magic and would take a good goddamn long time to cut through by conventional means. The stuff was wicked hard. Ulrich noticed the she-elf in front of him freeze and did the same. His eyes followed hers, not nearly as effective in the low light, and it took him a moment to make out the distinctly hostile posture of the guards. There were at least 12 arrows nocked and aimed at the two of them, and 0 cover. We are no threat. It is only Taipan, once Balder T's eldest daughter, and her honor the lord of the ancient glade. We are here to help. Ulrich may have magic from his homeland that can counteract the bane and save my father. His shadow boomed, really putting in some base. She wasn't actually threatening them, but she also made her declaration of aid to be more like warning, not to get in her way. Not the play Ulrich would have made, but, you know what? Taipan do Taipan things. To their credit, the guardsmen didn't move even a little bit. Discipline had been the underpinning of their training, and they did Idra proud. One of them, an elf Ulrich hadn't seen before, took charge, moving to the front to speak without actually being in the way of any of the bowmen. We know you, both of you. What I need to know is, how in the treeless hells did you get down here? Who spoke of this place? I will know, and they will water the roots for revealing it. Speak, Taipan, commanded the captain with a strong, rough for an elf voice. Taipan didn't take offense or show any surprise at this welcome, which was nice. Ulrich felt like any sudden movements or surprises were going to quickly be followed by an unfortunate accident. One he was positive he wouldn't survive. I entered through the unspoken door in the Arcaneum, and I know of it because Lord Baldert gets too deep in his cups and runs his tongue when he takes Mother Vadir to bed, Taipan shouted. Ulrich's expression turned to mild horror. Taipan was spying on her father when he went to shag her mother. Gross. Super mega ultra gross. He wasn't a prude, but the thought of walking in on his old man and mum bumping uglies was unpleasant in the extreme. They weren't as pretty as the elven royals, but still, yikes. Taipan noticed the look he was directing her way and rolled her eyes. What? I was tailing him through the fortress. How was I to know he'd start drinking in the mid-morning and canoodle my mother into making love in the audience room? He shouldn't be speaking of such things in a chamber made to carry voices from the dais anyway. Taipan whispered reproachfully. Really now? Baldert, you dog you. Ulrich kept his face carefully neutral, best not to show his appreciation for the sheer brass of that great man here. Later, if things turned out well, Ulrich would share a discreet fist bump of praise with the Elf King. Right now, don't get killed by his guards before you can try to save his life. It would appear that Taipan was not the only one who was aware of this sort of failure in security. The lead guard covered his eyes for a moment, whispering foulness that drew looks and caused some degree of ear-twitching in the ranks, before he drug his hand down a face wearing an incredibly put-upon visage. Be that as it may, the elf shouted, struggling to maintain gravitas, you should not be here. I know of you, Glade Chief, and I know you are in good standing with Lord Iriel, which is why we have not fired on you. But the ladies Iriel have told us to guard this door with our lives, and that is what we shall do. Ulrich decided it was now or never. I am only just now recovered enough from my injuries to be of any use to your lord. My shadow told me the nature of the bane, and I am certain it carries similar properties to poisons for which my people had found panaceas. The ladies could not know of these remedies, but they must be applied as soon as possible, before the damage is too widespread. This delay could be killing your liege. Go with me, send as many men to watch me as you like, but I need to tell Shaw what I know for her to have any chance of removing the poison. No one survives the bane, you know this. Please, Ulrich implored. It had already been a week. Even now he didn't know if anything could be done, if this heinous shit was as nasty as Taipan described. But the fact that these men were still down there said Baldert was still fighting, and Ulrich would do whatever it took to give him a chance. He didn't know how many of these guardsmen he could neutralize without killing them, but he had a fair suspicion that Taipan could go through them like a scythe through wheat. Shadows were abundant here in the near dark of the tunnel. The leader turned his head, and whispers faster than Ulrich could follow from so great a distance shot back and forth between the anxious guards. Eventually, love for their lord won out. The leader turned back to them. Very well, you are already here. Too late is it to weep over waters run downstream. The issue of my lord's impropriety can be dealt with later, if ever the chance arises. I will go with you myself, and whatever happens thereafter will lay on mine own head. Sina, you have the lead until I am returned, or another appointed, declared the hard-edged guardsman. Come. He addressed Ulrich, indicating that they were allowed to approach. He and Taipan quickly covered the distance through that unearthly tunnel. The door, a portal the same diameter as the tunnel, was opened, swinging open slowly and soundlessly. Ulrich choked slightly on his own spit when he saw that it was actually a 30-centimeter plate of Ectylis atzal bolted to a heartwood core a meter thick that, to Ulrich's eyes, fed back through one another through the half-meter bolts, composed of some silvery metal with which he was unfamiliar, but that, to his mana sense, burned brightly, creating a channel between the metal and the wood core. They fed each other, the Magebane into the heartwood and vice versa. Ulrich knew intuitively that the door would heal itself if attacked. The metal somehow granted the regenerative properties of the underlying magical wood, and the whole thing guarded from targeted magics that would try to undo them. It was the next thing to impregnable. God's blood. These people weren't fucking around down here. Through that grand barrier, they entered into a space that was different than any other. The dim green-gold glow of the spiraling corridor was gone, replaced by noonday bright gold light like a sunrise, given off by the gnarled wood walls of the ovoid chamber. Large as a cathedral, the walls sloped upwards, curving towards themselves, the ceiling soared up, and up, towering at least 60 meters. Hanging there, far above, was a crystalline tower, a prism of greens, browns, and gold, enshrouded partially by vines and twisting roots, extending from the walls of the chamber like a great spider web. He was looking at the naked core of the heartwood, the beating heart of Irielhos, and the linchpin of Iriel. No wonder he'd felt the manosphere thickening down here. No wonder the Irielan were so on edge about anyone knowing about this place. Ulrich felt again the sense that the very flesh of the chamber was aware of him and would destroy this space rather than allow harm to come to that crystal. The heartwood wasn't just alive, it was sentient. Deep currents, like long, slow notes played just outside his range of hearing, swirled in the mana field. Ulrich turned to Taipan, his eyes wide. She looked like he would imagine a man might who was seeing their god. Which, in a way, she was. He would have remained frozen there, would have lost himself to the ponderous currents that whispered of ages past, suns' rises uncountable, and the motions of stars beyond the comprehension of mortals. Had not Vadir broken his rapture? Unseen, unnoticed beneath the grandeur of the core of their great tree, was a bier surrounded by 3 elven figures of incredible peerless beauty. The bier contained a shrouded form, thin, emaciated, unconscious, though racked by agony nevertheless. Threads of gossamer light bound the women's forms to the figure on the bier. One looked away from her task, a rictus of fury on her face. "What is this? How have they come to the core of Iriel's patriarch? What are they doing here, Chorik? We hang on by a thread and you would interrupt." She sounded angry, she sounded tired, she sounded desperate, she sounded like he would imagine a wife might who was watching her husband die a slow, agonized death. The guardsman, Chorik, remained calm. "They are here on my life, Lady Vadir. The Glade Chief was told of the bane poisoning. He says there may be a way to stop the bane. I judged it worth a try. They had already found the core chamber." Vadir looked between her guard leader and Ulrich, eyes narrow, dark rings under them, and haggard features detracting somewhat from her great beauty. Whatever was going on here, she looked like she'd aged a decade. Her thoughts were plain enough: despair, confusion, a twinge of hope suppressed. "Speak to Shaw. I must return to my task. We are on the edge now," Vadir said, pain in her voice. Chapter 91. Ritualistic Organochemistry. Ulrich's gaze was drawn undeniably towards the bier, where lay Baldati Iriel, Lord of the Deep Wood, as near to a corpse as a living creature could be without being so. Distracted as he had been by the astonishing living core of the heartwood above, by the tapestry of energy woven by the 3 wives who attended him, Ulrich had not seen the spikes of silvered metal driven through his form into the bier, into the flesh of the great tree below. 12 slender rods of metal pinned the elven lord to the heartwood, and up through those magical connections rose the strength of the vast being that surrounded them, channeling its own power into the elf. Whatever they were doing, whatever ritual they had enacted here, it burned with puissance. His mana sense could barely see the edges of it. Like watching a storm roll across the ocean horizon, even as vast as the sight, the reality was still vaster. Vadir turned back to her focus, taking up reins of some enchantment beyond his ken. Shaw turned from her task to levy crimson eyes on him. She was as aged as her sister-wife, as drawn by the effort of their labor. "Tell me what you have come to say, Glade Chief. I cannot spare much time. We will fail here, but I will not surrender while life burns in him. Quickly now," she demanded, voice heavy with loss even as she struggled against it. "The bane is a targeted substance, with a very specific composition, a very specific signature, both physically and magically, yes?" Ulrich asked, trying to make sure his guesses were correct, so that the bounds on his theory were defined. "It is so. The bane is a revenant, a shard of the all-knowledge warped to destructiveness and given physical form through the core of the victim." Shaw told him, clipped tones impatient. "You can detect the presence of the bane through magic, spells that recognize its distinct signatures, even down to the last mote of it, yes?" Ulrich asked, keeping his voice steady. "This is also so. We can find any and all of the bane. I can feel it now in each part of my husband's body, in each piece of his core as it destroys him." The exhausted wife of Baldati said, hurrying him. Ulrich wasn't certain. He had not the magical expertise nor the familiarity with these matters to know if his ideas could bear fruit. But the basis was sound. In the background, a pulse of thrumming energy pinged off his mana sense, even though that was nearly useless in this chamber. Being here was like staring against the glare of a noonday Arctic snowfield, washed out with light but for that combination of physical and magical that made up his own arcane nexus. The core chamber was saturated with the elemental power of Irielhos, and the most recent pulse was merely a crest in the surf that was the roiling energies. All of this just to stave off the corrupting influence of the abomination that had been used to assassinate the Lord of the Deep Wood. They weren't even winning here, just barely hanging on. Focus Einar, solve problems. Then is there an herb, a metal, a soil, a creature, some form of material that will bind specifically to the bane, to all of it, no matter how small or secreted in the body? Ulrich asked, now trying to pin down the existence of a Kalata. Shaw's eyes widened, some of the life coming back into her. "There is. Heartwood ash, mixed with elf blood, distilled through a cooled flask. Mix it with the 1/100th volume of acid of silverbore beetle, and cool it again to near freezing, pouring off the liquid. A few other substances are added, but they are stabilizing agents and help to separate the desired product from the rest of the solution. This alchemical liquid can then be mixed with powdered acer bone, and dried, it will bind to any amount of bane, no matter how small. We use it to ensure that we have removed all of the toxin from an area, and to be certain that the land is safely decontaminated." Brief though it was, the budding hope fell out from her eyes, and her gaze was drawn indelibly back to her husband's fading life. Exhaustion and grief mingled again in her voice, but this does not help him. In this form, it cannot be delivered to the insides of a living being without binding the malevolence within his veins, stopping his heart's blood from flowing. It would kill him, and even if you administered it, all it would do is attack the bane inside him, it wouldn't remove it. She said, frustration welling, hope diminished. "But does the poison have the ability to spread when it is bound so?" Ulrich pressed. The Crimson Sphinx's mouth worked before she closed it. Her eyes went vacant. "No. No, it does not. Even though it tries to corrupt the flesh and mana, the elf blood in the purifying reagent binds, while the bone component isolates even the magical component of it. That does not remove the bane from the body, though Ulrich, we would already have tried that." "What is your point, Glade Chief?" "What do you have in mind?" Shaw said, still not convinced, but slowly starting to open her mind to the idea. Ulrich chewed his lip, his fingers popping at his thigh. They had a Kalata, a damned good one if they were so certain that no further contamination would exist after the cleanup. This just might work. He was never certain about being able to make such a thing. He wasn't a chemist. Well, sort of, but not a pharmaceuticals puke. Even so, if they had one, he might be able to figure out how to help them administer it. "One more question, Shaw, and then I think I might be able to give you a solution. The binding substance, the Shalata, does it still work when it's dissolved in water?" he asked, hopeful. Now she shook her head, waves of crimson slashing limply. "The powder does not dissolve, Ulrich. That is what I have said. She was getting short, and he didn't blame her, else we would use this collator of yours to help in the treatment. Shit, magic and material properties were doing weird shit in tandem. Perhaps this wasn't some Vardan fuckery though, plenty of things weren't soluble or miscible in water. Perhaps there was a chemical explanation. Something simple. Hell, what if it was as easy as the collator had a hydrophobic component, a strong one? How to solvate it? He pushed his brain back through 30 years of physical properties, solubility theory, kinetics, and pharmaceutical delivery tricks. This shit was known, he'd known it before, he just had to figure it out. While the clock ran closer and closer to zero. Not helpful, Ulrich. Ignore magical shenanigans, concentrate on the chemical process. Wood ash made the substance alkaline, reacted with the slightly alkaline blood, probably related to the carbonates, a heavy fraction of wood ash composition, along with the various organic alkanes and aromatics, particularly those benzene rings, unless it was a low-temperature burn making the ash heavy on 3 to 7 carbon alkanes and shifting the carbonates towards calcite instead. Fuck. Sure, does the ash come from a hot burn or a cooler fire? He checked, ignoring her confused expression. The heartwood must be burned in a forge that is already lit to create the ash, Glade Chief. She told him, still fixated on her husband, but curious at the seeming randomness of the question. All right, so calcite, benzene, small fraction of potash mixed with the blood, it makes something organic, that whatever is separated out by distilling. The result, acid washed, then mixes with bone powder, creates a bonding agent keyed physically and magically to the bane. Fair enough, it sounds like hocus pocus. But he'd heard of worse in a synthesis. So we have this complex organic compound. Then it gets reacted with acid to partially neutralize the solution, drive out the oxygen from the metallic complexes that have to be in there, thanks to the blood, denature the proteins to allow those heme groups to shake loose, and probably react with benzene to create some kind of cellulose/blood matrix stabilizing the molecule. Metal organic frameworks were an old tool for removing pesticides and toxic substances. The cooling further stabilized it, maybe helped it separate out from less volatile components whose freezing points were much lower. You got a liquid, a distinct separable liquid fraction, so probably a low-weight organometallic sugar. Piss. Those things loved water, that can't be the final substance, but then you mixed it with bone. Why the bone? Bone powder, mostly collagen and mineral salts, carbonated hydroxyapatite, predominantly calcium and phosphorus, phosphates, hey now. Bunch of metal phosphates fucking hate water, Ulrich old man, they precipitate instantly. That was it then, almost certainly. The end product was going to do some funky pseudo-mana chelation, but it was also going to tie up the physical component of the bane. He went back over the concept, looking for holes. It seemed sound. But what about the solvation later, to make it work inside somebody without killing them? It had to be forced into solution. It had to be. No neutralizing agent added past the acid and no titration. They couldn't be eyeballing it. Shaw was specific about the volume of acid. Wait, maybe that was only before the substance stabilized. Maybe the resulting collator could be acid-washed and diluted into water. Maybe? No, the acid would be too likely to break apart whatever complex is being formed from the metal-catching oxygen binder. Ulrich would bet his liver that there was an iron-binding heme group involved in tying up. Not oxygen in the collator, but bane molecules, fragments, evil spirits, fucking whatever. Fantasy magical bullshit on a different world or not. Some things just worked, and biology loved efficiency, magical bullshit poisons. For the first time in nearly a year, Ulrich felt like he needed a drink to cope with the stress. A drink? Ulrich's head jerked up, his fingers froze. A drink. Ulrich needed a drink, holy shit. Not acid, alcohol. You got lipid and phosphate solutes by polarizing them, and you didn't need an acid that destroyed the complexes, you needed an alcohol wash. Fuck, they needed booze. They needed that godsbedamned head splitter of a hooch. It'd work. It was a classic technique for solubilizing intractable oils and phosphates, and it didn't touch the binding component of the molecule. It just massaged it into mixing with water. Sure, we need to womp up some of your Banebinder. I know how to administer it without killing him. Probably, but I'm going to need your strongest spirits. If we can get the Kalata into him this way, I think it will be able to pull the poison away from the rest of him, stop it from creating new poison, and without causing his blood to harden and kill him. Best of all, if this works like it does back in my world, his liver and kidneys can interact with it, break it down for elimination from his body. The potency of this maniacal shit is how it corrupts elf matter into more bane. If we can stop it from doing that, I think his body will be able to process the chelated poison, given time. Time and whatever the fuck you guys are doing that feels like wrapping him in sunlight. Ulrich told her, absolutely certain he could make this work. Ulrich wasn't a chemist, and he was the farthest thing from a genius. But humanity had been riding on the backs of giants for some 3,500 years, and they had a habit of writing shit down. Just in case somebody came along who could connect the dots. 20 years of a classical education for the win. He owed his mother an apology. She always said he'd thank her someday for insisting, and here he was. Thanks, Mom. I might be able to save a friend. Shaw's eyes bored into him, dissecting out every secret he'd ever held. Whatever she found there made her decision. I will make the Bane purification powder, and then you will save my husband. If you fail, and you have taken the time and energy from me that I could have used to keep him just a few days longer, I will tear your heart out. Do we have a bargain, Ulrich Einar? It would have been scary if he'd had any doubts. Wait, no, never mind, it was still terrifying. Done. Can someone else make the powder and allow you to go back to helping them do whatever that is? Ulrich said, gesturing wildly at the circulating power around the other she-elves and their fading husband. No, it would take them too long, and then they would have to transport it here. No, I will do it. I have the reagents at hand, for when all hope was lost. Shaw admitted, profound pain bleeding through her control. The spirits I will send Korik for. Korik! She snapped. The elf appeared as if pulled by strings. Yes, Lady Shaw. Your will? The dedicated guard asked. You will go and obtain the amphora of vanished knights. The good one, the one I keep hidden from Lord Baldert. You know it? Shaw asked. I am the one who has changed its location since the last time you commanded it retired, lady, and the twice more hence, when Lady Bathe and Vedder each ordered it holed and cornered upon discovery. I know it, answered Chorik, who then fled at top speed. Ulrich did not envy him the climb. That was an interesting image. Had Ulrich stumbled into a domestic conspiracy? Even if this works, it will only delay the inevitable Glade Chief. There is still the Bane inside him. Shaw said, weariness bending her posture. Ulrich nodded, he was aware. They needed a way to destroy the Bane's influence on Baldert's mana. It was this corrosion that led to the corruption of his core and the generation of fresh poison. All right, this is where I am afraid that you ladies will be of far more use than I. Here is the theory. The Bane is some kind of anti-Essa construct, almost a malicious soul, given physical structure, but it is, fundamentally, a magical creation, right? Which means it's sort of like an elemental anti-elf mana. It interacts with normal elf mana and inverts it into itself, sort of like a mirror flipping the image of whatever is cast in it. Ulrich tested. Shaw thought it over, tapping her chin. Ulrich could see her fighting through the days of whatever this ritual had required of her. The other two were so deep into their concentration that he could barely tell they were alive. They barely breathed. He couldn't fathom the kind of willpower it took to maintain that for a literal week unending. Eventually she gathered her thoughts enough to speak them. More or less, Ulrich Glade Chief. More or less. It is certainly true that the mana signature to find Bane is a near mirror to the one I would use to make, say, a hunter's mark for any of the Orlathrem, or to bind a curse to the Acer in general, she admitted almost casually. A curse to an entire people. And somebody had tried to assassinate her husband. Whatever happened here, those people were boned. Ulrich imagined Vedir ghosting around their cities, harvesting souls. Bathe crushing their armies in the field like a rampaging beast, and all the while, Shaw crafted creeping death. He put the imagined vengeance that would roll out from this place out of his mind. They used a Bane. Whoever they was had it coming. All right, Shaw, Then I think we might have a way to interfere with the Bane's mana signature. We can create a mana pattern that matches the Bane in such a way as to force it to resonate. Just like you told me, unexpected mana resonates with everything. We force the Bane to resonate destructively with itself, so that it destroys its own mana inside Boulder T's core, even while the Shalata binds whatever poison has escaped into his body, or will while you do whatever, he explained vaguely, describing his hunch and pointing to the ritual. Shaw blanked. She was gone, buried so deep in her own mind that he had stopped existing. It creeped him out. 1 second there, penetrating gaze with her full attention on him, the next she might have died. A few seconds, 3 of Ulrich's somewhat quickened breaths, and she was back, laser-focused. It is done. I have the resonance spell form. This was a remarkable idea, Ulrich. Where did you learn this? The elf asked, distracted for the first time from her husband's ordeal. Or maybe just multitasking so hard it seemed that way to a guy with Ulrich's limited hardware. Done, just like that. From a poorly outlined half-theory, half-wild-assed guess to a functional bane-destroying spell, if only it could be kept from contaminating Boulder T's physical matter. In a couple of seconds, and they had the nerve to say Ulrich was freakish. Oh, okay, geez. I guess we should get started on the Kelata, Ulrich said uncertainly. She rejected that idea instantly. No, you are still weak from your injuries, and I will not risk your clumsiness ruining the process. You will explain to me this process to modify the Chelata, you say, in as fine a detail as you are capable of, and I will implement it. Then you will leave this place and take Veda's daughter with you before she finishes collapsing from mana sickness. Shaw told him flatly. Mana sickness? Ulrich looked to Taipan, who had gone somewhat pale and was sweating profusely. He scanned her quickly and saw that she did indeed have mana sickness at its initial stage. Sweet Watcher's tits, Taipan, why didn't you say anything? He cried. She looked affronted that he would even ask. Because you are here, and if you are here, then I am here with you. I had thought that I had made that clear yesterday, and then again this morning. And then twice more, she said with familiar sarcasm, lightened by a smug grin in spite of her complexion, and no blushing at all in her ears. Well, Ulrich certainly was. Being open and having her talk about her, call it athletic prowess, in front of her parents was a different thing. She really was acting more like her father ever since she'd stopped blaming everybody else for her problems. He liked this new her, even with the fangs. He looked over towards the beer, resting underneath that shimmering colossus of a core, the whole place illuminated by golden fluorescence. He really hoped he had helped save her dad. He owed that wily elf this much and more. Shaw had assembled a set of alchemical equipment while he was distracted and was organizing everything with efficient, tidy movements. You know the look of an experienced tradesman when they were doing their thing, and it was just best to stay out of the way. Anything you did to help would just cost them time when they had to work around you. The rest of the room disappeared from her mind, and he could have juggled chainsaws without getting her attention. Ulrich's brain popped. Hey, who the hell is in charge of this place if you guys are down here? Ulrich inquired. His shadow tilted her head, as if slightly confused. Did I not mention? Herr Lumitsite is acting chief of Iriel until father can resume his duties, if he ever can. Until the war is over, all of father's titles and responsibilities are his to dispose. There will be a moot, once the war is concluded, to choose a new leader. But until then, Lumitsite is crown of Orlithrum. He is doing very well already. Taipan said, pride in her voice for her youngest brother. Chapter 92. To create solutions. He stared at her. She had to be making this up. Bright Eyes was a kid, a sharp kid, a great kid, but a kid. He's older than you are, Ulrich, in whichever world you want to think about, his traitor brain whispered. Is he ready for that kind of responsibility? I mean, he's pretty young to be ruling a nation, isn't he? Ulrich checked. Taipan considered that for only a moment, deciding that this was more of her honor being unused to the ways of this. His new world. None are ready for the mantle of kingship, Ulrich. They can prepare as they like, but to feel the weight of your people's lives on your every word is not a natural thing, said his shadow. That was a surprisingly wise thing to say. He forgot at times, thanks to her nature and her appearance, that the lovely lady had been around the block a few times. Fair point, Taipan, fair point, he conceded. Bright Eyes is in charge, then. How safe is he? I don't know about any of you, but I thought Irielhos was untouchable. The way I understood it, your kin would know an enemy was coming for 1,000 kilometers. That dickbag mage caught me with my pants down. Ulrich probed. He'd actually almost literally had his pants down. He'd done up his belt a couple of seconds before he got his shit roasted. Now was that hateful scowl on Taipan's face, but not directed towards him. Blood, pain, and death spiraled around in her emerald eyes, shimmering metallic flecks seeming to flash in her irises. The beasts of Prosper used an artifact. We found its remains on the cryomancer archmage who led the attack. It had been burned through, its powers destroyed, but our lawmasters identified it. It was old, from the time of the ancients, and it cloaked those near it from our wards and detection, in the mundane and in the magical. Taipan revealed, the shock of their veil of safety being broken still lodged in her heart. They used the artifact to break the wards on Irielhos, the shields that guarded it against the elements and magical attacks. That was not the intended use for the device, the energies consumed it. But it worked. The forces that conspire against Iriel used it, for years probably, to weave in and out of our protections. They created channels, hidden paths of safe travel through our wards to move undetected. That is why they were on the plateau. They were setting up a base of operations, to be able to hold a high ground from which to launch attacks through the Ancient's Gate. His shadow explained, disbelieving. My mothers, your dragons, found the anchor points for these invasion routes and destroyed them, along with the ones facilitating their creation. 27 agents for the merchant kings, bought for gold and paid with death for breaking the peace and making war against Orlathrem. Taipan said, an evil set to her features. It was this closing of the gaps in our defense that triggered the attack. They saw their window to hurt us closing and were forced to spring the trap before it was truly ready. She continued, laying out the full scope of the conspiracy. In the spring, when they intended to launch their attack, the intent was to have this assault accompanied by their ground forces, moving into Orlathrem and bypassing its defenses to strike us from multiple angles, from positions that should have been impossible. It would have been a catastrophe. The Orlathrem are strong, but much fewer than Prespang. Always we have used the space to punish invaders, to funnel and control their movements and thus spare most of the population from danger. This plan, had it worked, would have had us pinned into corners from the beginning. A great many Ersa would have perished, even if we were able to find eventual victory. More likely, Orlathrem, as it exists today, would have been shattered. Ulrich whistled softly. That was, more or less, the worst-case scenario. The mage assault would have decapitated the Orlathrem Confederation's leadership, crippled the predominant force projection of the elves, the Irielen, and delivered a mortal blow to the morale of the elves while carving them up with superior numbers. Total war with a sprinkle of genocide. Humans really did seem to be the same wherever you found them. All it took was a couple of sociopaths wielding the power of nations to inflict horror on the rest of the world. A song of many names and a dance with the same eventual steps. What changed, Taipan? From what I've heard, there has been a peace, uneasy though it may have been, for hundreds of years. Why now? Ulrich asked, not even certain if it mattered. His shadow shrugged, clearly of the same mind. Who is to know the minds of these people, Ulrich? There is a reason the otherkin are not welcome in Iriel. We simply grew tired of trying to understand why they brought their evils to our lands, why they did as they did. It was enough to know that they would, eventually. I painted you with that brush, unjustly perhaps, but not entirely without reason. I regret that immensely, but I hope you can understand now some of it. Taipan pled. It didn't taste good, no sir. Could he truly blame her for her attitudes? Yes, he decided, yes he could. That was the point, after all. Every man is responsible for his own actions, and only his own actions. Every individual is given the right of being treated as they deserved, instead of being treated as the worst of their kind. There was no wrong in hating someone. Some people deserved that contempt. Some people earned it. But it was important to hate them for their choices, not for who their parents happened to be, or for where they were born, or what they looked like. I understand it, Taipan. I do. It doesn't make it right, but I do. He offered. Unfortunately, my homeworld had records detailing, in painful detail, the excesses a man might commit against another man for no better reason than he was different in appearance, or had resources they wanted, or prayed to a different cosmic ghost. Old drowned Japan came to mind. They'd essentially declared their lands off-limit towards foreigners and went almost 99% pure isolationist. It didn't solve the problems and eventually boiled over into a global crisis. They'd done things that didn't bear mention lest it recall the ghosts of the victims. That was just a little slice of what humanity could offer to itself. Later, other peoples had done worse, punctuating it with the burning of the world with radiation. I was onto something, a hunch, before the attack Taipan. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and I meant to tell your father about them when we met that evening. Then, everything happened and I never got the chance. Ulrich told his shadow gently. He walked her through his thoughts, his conjectures, his best approximations of what was happening. The appearance of a concerted long-term strategist, a guiding hand that was moving the normally too disjointed press-bang forces into a united and, worse, subtle enemy. Taipan considered him with fresh respect. Her honor was many things, but he had not impressed her greatly with his disposition towards war and tactics. This was a scenario so plausible that she was surprised none of her father's inner ring had considered it. Except that it was nearly impossible to even conceive of a multi-generational strategy from the changeable and far more ephemeral races. Still, enough pieces seemed to fall into place that it represented a potential blind spot, easily seen from the perspective of an outsider. Then he surprised her again. "What are the odds it isn't a human at all calling the shots here, Taipan?" Ulrich said suddenly. "You Fey folk always take the long view. You criticize the Valin and Jorman for their short-term approaches, and from a strategic framework, that's valid. They get outmaneuvered because you Acer can afford to draw things out beyond the lifespan of any single human, and they get impatient. So what if someone who lived as long as you do, who had the time to play the long game from behind the curtains, moving the leaders of Prosper in a predetermined track for several generations, was really in charge?" he mused, mind spinning down new trails. Taipan looked like he'd swatted her between the eyes with a brick. "Impossible. None of Orlethrum would do such a thing, not even the meanest Zealosin pig," she nearly shouted, clearly disturbed. He was a natural 10th man, willing to play devil's advocate until a topic was nailed down to be as airtight as possible. He might not be the sharpest tool in the shed, but he was sharp enough to force the rest to defend themselves properly or be cut. Yeah, but what if? Maybe the long piece wasn't a piece, it was a slow draw up. They were letting their forces multiply, getting their supply lines established and fortified. They were setting up a decisive move with a lot of little conflicts, like feinting with jabs so you can load up an overhead that comes out of nowhere, Ulrich hypothesized. "I'm sorry, Taipan, but if your folk have one weakness, it's that they look down too much on us short-lived people. Properly organized, outfitted, and mobilized, they could bury you under sheer numbers. Especially if they got the jump on you, which is what they were trying for here. To a certain extent, the gamble paid off. Baldar T is out of commission. Even if we can save him, he won't be ready to spearhead the counterattack in the spring. Idra is laid up too. We lost a big chunk of infrastructure, and a bunch of your best warriors are gone." He summarized, brutally honest. She didn't like it, not at all, but she didn't complain either. He could see her making the same conclusions for herself. "What if we do the same to them?" he asked abruptly. Taipan blurted, "What?" "Well, yeah, you guys are all about being defensive and everything, and you do it pretty well, but what if we just send a couple of real crackerjack hunters to wipe out their leadership?" he proposed. She made that cute little scrunched-up thinking face. Eventually, she tossed her shortened hair to dissent. "It will not work. Elves are too scarce in human lands to avoid attention, especially Irielen. We do not leave our borders to any real extent. Even what trading we do is performed through intermediaries with the Zealosin, the Actinian, or Lagranel. The river, the sea, or the plains, these are the only contacts we have with Pressbang, and none of them direct. Irielen hunters would have to pass through a very great distance and would have to do so completely undetected. The first whisper of Irielen would put them on full alert. They haven't forgotten what happened when the blood moon rose over Prosper, even if they didn't learn anything from it. Taipan countered. Yeah, I get that, so why don't I go? Ulrich asked. What? She replied, completely baffled. Yeah, I look like a human, I'd blend right in. Hell, I could probably walk right into Prosper, knock on the door, and they'd just let me in, and boom goes the dynamite. Ulrich proposed earnestly. She was still reeling from the previous question when he dropped that on her. He gave her a minute to digest it. Her lips parted a few times to counter him but closed, her having answered her own argument. Eventually she managed to work herself out. Why would you volunteer to do this, Ulrich? She asked, not suspiciously exactly, but genuinely curious. Which seemed silly to Ulrich, given the circumstances. Hello? Earth to Taipan? They tried to kill me and got closer than I like to think about to doing it right. I'm on their hit list already. I owe them about 7 kinds of hell, and I got this little voice in the back of my head that is whispering just sweet, sweet, awful shit that I'd like to do to them. Besides which, they sponsored child abuse, genocide, and hurt my friends. I'd MDK them all for like half of that, Ulrich said flatly. What? What is this MDK? Taipan asked. Murder, death, kill. It's an old Earth thing, means killing them as hard as physically possible. Suffice it to say, the only thing I'd like to do more than get my hands on them is put my hands on you. He told her honestly. She blushed furiously. Blushed and smiled at the ground. All of this, and that's what gets her knees weak. Sometimes he forgot how hardcore the Irielen were. They liked peace and quiet and carving beautiful furniture, but pissed them off, and no daisies were these Apache-spirited bush hippies. Underneath their love of life was a cold iron will to destroy anything that threatened their people or their lands. He was of a mind with them, and more so by the day. Odd that he could find more in common with these frequently bewildering grove tenders than he ever had most of the humans in his old life. Maybe that watcher hadn't been full of shit with its talk of souls mixed across worlds. The two of them were silent for a while, each buried in their own thoughts. Shaw bustled, her glassware coming together, her ingredients sorted neatly. A small, ornately carved box, like a cigar box of ash, mixed with sawdust. The fine particles within shimmered with that crawling mirage that accompanied near to invisible movement. The sawdust was trying to heal, to form a solid piece, to revive itself. Ulrich couldn't believe the sheer vitality of that stuff. By most metrics, he could come up with, Heartwood was, effectively, immortal. Next to the box was a vial of what was clearly blood. The bubbles and a small bandage on Shaw's arm indicated that it was freshly gathered. The vial she emptied into a container that held water, but with the optical refraction of brine, a saltwater bath. Oh, a hypertonic bath to extract water from and lyse or break open the blood cells. The diluted blood swirled in her hand evenly. Shaw looked intently into the glass, seeing some sign that Ulrich couldn't discern, and poured the fluid back into the vial through a funnel that held a layered cloth filter. Ulrich had no idea what was in that cloth, but as the red dripped through into the vial, only 3/4 the original volume, the cloth turned into what Ulrich could only generously refer to as a scab. Clotting cloth. A selective filter that had removed coagulants. As some natural materials did, apparently the elves knew how to generate battlefield trauma hemostats. Shaw discarded the cloth and filtrate, literally dropping them to the ground, only they burned to ash halfway. She didn't even glance towards the smoke that drifted upwards, focusing instead on her vial and taking up the box of heartwood ash and dust. The normally expressionless elven woman mixed these into a clear, crystalline glass bottle, vaguely Erlenmeyer flask-shaped. First, the filtered blood was poured into the flat-bottomed glassware to sit around a quarter full. Next came the sawdust and ash, mixed vigorously as it was poured using a stone spoon. Soon, a thick, almost paste had formed. Shaw did something with mana, and the air around the glass shimmered with heat. The concoction began to bubble almost immediately. The stirring did not stop. For 5 minutes, the heated mixing continued. Another piece of spellwork, so fast, so precise that Ulrich couldn't feel it, and Shaw released the spoon, which continued to stir as she assembled the distillation apparatus, which had many of the familiar, though unexpectedly sophisticated shapes of glass with which Ulrich had worked before. A set of bamboo-looking scaffolds to which all the pieces were anchored with fine cord, hopefully thermotolerant. The three-way adapter, a still head, was secured such that the bamboo frame could simply be lowered onto the reagent flask to begin the distillation proper. A spiraling tube inside of another tube, which was incredibly similar to a Graham condenser, was connected to that still head. A smaller, wide-mouthed collection flask, mated with the condenser in its neck, through a port that had a rubberish gasket to seal the pieces together. The top of this collection flask was sealed. Shaw cast again, a spiral of water running through the outer tube of the long double-tube device, the inner spiral of glass remaining empty. It was a Graham condenser. Carefully, whispering to herself, she moved her hands along the condenser, and frost collected on its surface. She was using some kind of infrig spell to cool the water, maybe even supercool it, to catch every bit of the vapor coming off the distillation flask. This guaranteed that even the most volatile of the gases would be forced into liquid phase to fall into the collection flask. Similarly, the collection flask got the frost treatment. Whatever she was making, it must be volatile as hell to need that much cooling. Thus readied, Shaw extracted the stir spoon and mated the distillation head to the reagent flask, and plugged the top with a simple glass column. The third neck of the head got another rubber plug. This one contained a device with markings with which Ulrich wasn't familiar. He would have bet his underpants it was a thermometer, though. This setup was too finessed, too refined, to be operating without a specific temperature range. No wonder Shaw hadn't wanted his help. She'd left out a lot of the details of her synthesis. Moving to the reagent flask, she did something to increase the temperature, watching the pips on the thermometer glow in increasing number. Once it hit a certain value, whose exact nature Ulrich knew nothing of, it could have been just water boiling temp and even 100 Celsius. It could have been triple that. All he knew was that the thick, sluggish, dark brown mixture was at a rolling boil and had begun to go a darker grey. It appeared that the timing was not accidental. The initial time was a cook-off to drive off the water in the blood. Instantly, bubbles of a red-gold liquid had begun to form in the spiraling tube, condensate. These built until a flow was established, at which point the condenser began to drip into the collection flask. Fascinating. Ulrich hadn't expected to see semi-advanced chemistry, but here it was. A quarter hour, maybe more, and the reagent flask had cooked down to a very thick black sludge, carbonized remnants. In the collection flask sat a heavy, viscous red-gold liquid. And there was a serious bit of magical fuckery going on here if he was looking at what he thought he was looking at. Because that was not how distillation was supposed to work. You can't distill blood cells, really. They carbonize and burn up. What should have been in that reagent flask was the destroyed organic goop of the blood and sawdust. The only thing that should have been in the collection flask was water, not whatever the fuck he was looking at, which he was at least somewhat certain was a type of spirit tree, cellulose organo-metallic elf magic complex, keyed to bane poisons through mechanisms he doubted he'd ever understand. Suddenly, he wasn't so sure about his plan to use alcohol. There were other things going on, other interactions, probably thanks to mana, that made the rules different here. Not all the way different, clearly, but different in ways that made it impossible for him to predict the ways that substances interacted. Sorry, Taipan, looks like Shaw gets to kill me, he thought morosely. Still, he couldn't help but observe the crimson-haired woman in her surgically precise workflow. To the cooled flask, she added a black liquid from a teardrop-shaped ampule she'd pulled from her belt and which she broke as if it contained nitroglycerin. A few drops, no more, down into the red-gold liquid. As the droplets fell through the liquid, they swirled violently black and then somehow silver. Shaw seemed relieved, so he guessed that was supposed to happen. She placed her hands on either side of the now silver mixture, and Ulrich watched as ice crystals thickened on the surface of the flask. The silver mixture separated, a pale yellow seed growing on the bottom of the flask, expanding fractally as it did. The crystal of whatever the fuck soon occupied the bottom of the flask. A much smaller, maybe 2/3 of the silver remained. Shaw swiftly collected a darkened glass, its smoky charcoal amber color nearly impossible to see through, and decanted the silver liquid into it. With a relieved sigh, she drew out a pouch and dumped what could only be powdered elf ivory into the mixture. It did something fluorescent inside there, and from what he saw through the obscuring glass, turned into a marble-white liquid, still viscous, though less so if the swirl of the mixture as she shook it was any indication. Placing the smoked glass bottle on her bench top, she looked up for the first time and held Ulrich's eyes. Thus is the bane purifying powder created. In a few hours it will dry finer than the finest chalk and can be spread to neutralize the remaining bane in an infected area. What it will not do is mix with water to be administered. Shaw said, slightly reproachfully, as if she already knew the outcome. We will see, Ulrich said, though unable to keep a small hesitation from his voice. That entire process was both extremely similar to things he'd seen and done, and also so wildly different as to be completely alien. But he was committed now. He just had to hope that the general idea was sound. Physical principles had translated pretty well so far, at least as far as fundamental forces went. He just had to hope that the emergent properties associated with mana being infused into matter on this wild land called Varda didn't completely scare off core chemical interactions. About that time, Chorik limped into the chamber, bleeding freely from a half-dozen cuts and missing the sleeve of his left arm. There were chew marks on his armor. Cradled in his arms was the clay amphora of spirits. Where exactly the hell had they hidden that stuff? I am arrived, Lady Shaw. The vanished night was where I left it, beneath the menagerie floor. The shadow panther did not care for me digging into its bed, but I was able to retrieve the amphora. The shadow panther will live, minus a few teeth and half of its front left leg. The bastard. Chorik nearly punctuated his statement by spitting on the floor before he remembered where he stood and swallowed it. Ah, that elf had climbed some 30 flights of stairs to fight a greater beast at the end of it, salvaged a clay bottle, and got back in time to see the end of Shaw's little chemistry project. His estimation of Chorik went up several notches. So too did his concern that such lengths had been gone to keep Baldurt out of it. What in the name of all that was holy was that stuff? Moonshine that would get God shit-faced? Not important, Einar, so long as it's proper alcohol it'll work, he hoped. Now all the materials were in place. The great working underneath the heartwood core was ongoing. Bathe appeared to be struggling greatly. At Ulrich's glance, Shaw informed him that the golden-haired she-elf was circulating Baldurt's mana for him and also destroying the bane in his core as it formed, so that it did not escape to continue to poison him. Doing both of those things at the same time for a week without pausing was considered to be impossible. Only the support of this place, bathed in the mana of the Irielhos, allowed it. That and the fact that bathe was bathe. They waited. An hour turned to 2. Silence settled into this place. Only the thrumming of the living wood around them said that time passed. Shaw stood without warning, startling everyone in the room except for her sister wives, who were too engrossed with their task to be aware of anything else. She inspected the darkened glass container and poured a small amount of glittering white crystals, like diamond dust, into her hand, a small satisfied twist to her lips. A difficult chore completed to perfection. Her eyes took him in, and she nodded solemnly. It was time, to live or to die, based on the half-remembered science of a dead world. Hey, Shaw, since this might not work and all, do you mind if I, take a sip? Seeing as how you're going to kill me if it doesn't and all, Ulrich proposed. She hummed briefly, tapping her lips with a long fingernail. A fingernail he hadn't noticed earlier, being shaped like a vicious claw. I do not see any problem with this, no, but just a sip, Glade Chief, and I hope that you work swiftly. The vanished night is quite potent and exceedingly abrupt with its effect. Gotcha, thanks, Shaw. Okay, do you guys have any intravenous drip bags? Like a water bag, but with a small tube and a hollow needle to deliver fluids into the blood of a wounded elf that cannot drink. He checked. They could probably get the stuff into Baldurt without it, but it was good to see if there was a better way before you defaulted to a worse. They did not. Typically, a syringe was used to put fluid down the invalid's throat. Damn, fine. Ulrich then explained his need and, by his description, within half an hour was there a water bag, sterilized, which was filled with pure water, and a long, flexible, hollow vine, also sterilized, fitted with a dart for the administering of poison, because of course that's what needles were used for around these parts, and it too was, you guessed it, sterilized. Ulrich worked a hole into the bag and affixed the vine in firmly. He applied a sticky resin until no more water seeped from the bag to vine interface. Whammo, one Sylvan intravenous bag. Taipan dubbed it a sleeper's drink. 3 more were constructed to provide a steady supply of chelata, for as long as that proved necessary. Soon the IV bags or sleeper's drinks were placed before him. He was as ready as he would ever be. No sense in risking losing any product by transferring it. Ulrich lifted the amphora to his lips and took a great swallow, feeling an intense rush of molten metal down his esophagus and then a blissful nothingness. Then he poured the amphora, every remaining drop, into the smoked glass with the Bane purification powder. He shook it vigorously, seeing the tiny glitters of crystal refracting what little light made it into the container. He looked over at Shaw while he did. You'll need to mix this with pure water and then cook off most of the remaining alcohol, reduce it by about half the volume. At least, that's how it's down in my world. If it works, you'll be able to hook up the IV bags inside an hour and start delivering the collation. He told her, just in case he lost his ass from the night water. Hopefully, if there was enough similarity between this world and his old one, the alcohol would dissolve the crystals without destroying them, creating a solution that was then capable of being miscible with good old-fashioned pure water. Such was the art of the chemist. A simple idea, just rinse with alcohol, based upon exceedingly complex interactions of electron densities, and who the fuck actually knew what else? The idea was, to make the powder able to save Boulder T's life, it needed to be able to diffuse into his body to reach all the infected tissue and bind the Bane poison, all of it, stopping its damage and preventing it from renewing itself as Veda, Bathe, and Shaw worked to eliminate it with their spooky tree ritual. In other words, the spirit booze would allow the powdered magical bullshit powder to do the thing with the magical water on the king elf. Oh, Ulrich said, suddenly confused. That stuff hits like a truck. He blacked out. Once again, Ulrich woke to stare at a strange ceiling, a state that had become far, far too common for his liking. Say this for the elves, each room was immediately recognizable for the unique reliefs and carvings that decorated it. Each chamber of the fortress was its own little monument to the love of the Irielen for their forest homeland, its running rivers, its wilderness, and the critters that they shared it with. Ulrich sat up and immediately regretted it when some invisible jerkwad put a railroad spike between his eyes. Fortunately, the murderer rethought the error of their ways and replaced the spike with a nice kick bass, set to the metronome of his own heartbeat. Considerate bugger, for a brain murderer. He opened his eyes to the too bright room. The pace and timing of events somewhat eluded him. He'd been escorted, which was a way of preserving his dignity, rather than, say, drug helplessly like a child, to the secretive heart of Iriel Hos, the chamber of light and magic, unlike anything he'd ever experienced. He'd seen the ritual being carried out by Boulder T's wives in their desperate bid to save the life of the Lord of the Deep Wood. After finding out more about the nature of the remedies for Bane poisons, the magically targeted Akashic poison of a torture-corrupted soul, he had gone out on a limb to create a slight modification to the binding substance they used to turn it into a true chelata that could be administered. He'd taken a swallow of the exceedingly potent liquor, the alcohol source for the final step of the chelation synthesis, and then nothing. He wasn't actually sure how long they'd been down there, or how long he'd been here. He felt somewhat rested, despite the hangover. There was a sort of shallow crick in his neck that he tried and failed to massage out. Though his body might have rested, it wasn't recovered. He couldn't see outside, so he remained in a foggy nether place as it regards to time. His instincts said it was a new day, but where inside that he was absent any clue. Ulrich laid back down, letting a comfortable downy comforter envelop his chest. At least, whatever had happened to him involved the acquisition of a new bed. This one was as fine as the one in his former, now destroyed apartment. The perfect blend of firmness and softness, his body sought to become one with this mattress. The silken fabric of the sheets, somehow always remaining just ever so slightly on the cool side, made his eyes close with tactile joy. If a man just had to die in bed, this was the bed he ought to do it in. No telling the difference between here and heaven, Ulrich told himself with a small laugh. He doubted very much that heaven would exist, which made this bed an even greater promise of reward than that fiction. Yes, I will start the cult of the bed. And lo, we will all of us, brothers, go to our just reward, the space between its sheets, if only you dedicate your bodies, your very souls, to my orders. Repent, cast off your masters and slave yourselves to this, the only Lord who brings you eternal rest. And I, the speaker of the pillows, will guide you to the promised land. They would rule the world, if only they knew what they were all missing here, he lamented. His budding religion was cast aside without warning when the heavy door to the room swung inwards and a marvel of feline grace, sensual power and feminine beauty entered the room. She replaced his bed as his new god because she had donuts. Glazed donuts. He smelled the sugar, the crisp exterior, the oven smell, and her. She had her own spice to add to the bouquet. The angel of donuts approached, her arms cradling a large tray of the incredible-smelling glazed, fried bundles of doughy joy. He didn't cry. He only wanted to. As she settled the tray on an end table, he observed her hips, noting the curve and subtle geometry. Was it wrong to touch that which was made for holding? No. No, that could not be right. Ja, Ulrich, you. All right, fine. Have your fill. She strangled before mellowing. Turning, she pushed her hip against his stroking hand. He closed his eyes so he could focus his existence down to that one appendage and its little attendant appendages. Such softness coupled to strength, shaped just so, a miracle of form and function. Perfectly balanced, with its mirror on the other side of her. Ulrich came to the slow realization that he was actually still smashed. Distant reason jotted down a note as to why the bottle was hidden under a vicious animal's bed. His eyes opened and he saw his shadow, unclasping her belt. He also noticed a wall-length mirror that he'd somehow missed earlier. The crick in his neck was identifiable as a series of bruises that matched suspiciously with the even rows of neat, pearly teeth smiling hungrily at him right now. Aha! Now the mystery was solved. Donut Angel had gone to keep herself from consuming him in her eternal hunger. "Forgive me, Donuts," he screamed internally as her coat and shirt descended hatefully to the floor, promising cold futures instead of prompt consumption of the treats. His hand came away as she performed a minor miracle of balance and flexibility to pull off the thigh-high boots while standing, arching backward like a ballerina with her leg extended upwards behind her. She repeated this feat with the other leg and shimmied out of her coarse, sturdy trousers. Turning to him, he saw primal energy in her eyes and a challenge in the set of her stance. Or he was simply extremely hammered and she was just her normal naked self, which caused his hormones, in concert with the loss of frontal lobe activity, to project his own needs onto her. Potato. Ulrich threw aside the covers and beckoned her on. "Come on, thou predator. Take what you may to fill thy gullet." Some few minutes later, Ulrich was finally starting to sober up, possibly thanks to not having any liquid left in his body. Panting gently, he turned to the dark woman next to him, who was humming a merry tune. "I understand now why your mothers hid the vanishing knight from your father. That stuff, it's dangerous," Ulrich admitted somewhat apologetically. Taipan was, for her part, smirking at him and did not seem unpleased. This was the second time he had evaporated a night with an otherworldly beauty by way of near brain death. "I will not find excess in my cups again," he decided. The loss was simply too great. "It is for special occasions, Ulrich, or for when they wish to spoil themselves. For anniversaries, birthdays, full moons, that sort of thing," she explained. "Father used to like to slip it into their cups as a prank. After everyone had already gone and they were in private, of course. I believe that is what is responsible for 3 of Shaw's daughters." Taipan continued, her disappointment in her father's behavior obvious. Vedia caught him in the act once, though, and beat him viciously. He swore to never be caught doing such a thing again. I am not sure if that meant he would not do it again, or if he would merely never be apprehended. Father Baldert is never one to say a single thing when he can squeeze more than that into a single utterance. He had learned something new. About his host, about himself, and about the ancient crone next to him. The drumbeat in his skull eased up as they sat abed, devouring cold donuts. The past 2 days were as near to paradise as he'd ever come. He knew it in his heart. That suddenly reminded Ulrich that he hadn't so much as thought about protection. "Taipan, am I knocking you up?" he asked. She patted his leg comfortingly once she had him explain what that idiom meant. "No, Ulrich, you are not. Elf women come into season once every other year, for a period of around 2 weeks. You would know if that time had come. Either she goes into isolation if she does not wish children, or she drags her chosen sire into her chambers and he is not seen again until that time is done. My season was early this past spring, and of course I was in isolation. In truth, I was in the deep wilds evading a gilded queen's rose that had my scent. It had been eating harvesters and was near ready to blossom. A good hunt." She recalled to him with pride. "Your dad suggested I go get the core from one of those once. How bad an idea is that?" he asked, hoping she'd go into further depth on her escapades. She really did like to recall her time in the wilds. He knew it was where she'd found happiness. "Very, Glade Chief. You see, the petals are slathered in toxic dust that confuses the senses and triggers powerful hallucinations. The barbs on the vines contain an acid that will melt bones and flesh in moments. The trick, you see, is—" Her excited voice rolled over him as he lay there. He hadn't asked about Boldart, or how things had turned out, but she seemed more relaxed than at any point before, as if a weight had gone. Part of him knew she had been using him to comfort herself, as a balm to soothe her pain at losing him. If that was how she intended to use him, go ahead and sign him up for the full package. For himself, he was glad that he had a whatever they were, and that she wasn't trying to shove needles into his eyes at every opportunity. At last, when she'd exhausted her, admittedly incredibly comprehensive knowledge on the hunting, killing, harvesting, and revenue-generating potential of the Gilded Queen's Rose, Ulrich stepped into the pause with the idea he was tossing around. "So, Taipan, I think it's about time I took this whole learning to kill people stuff a bit more seriously. I'm not 100% yet, but I feel the strength coming back pretty quickly. I'd like it if you started teaching me every way to kill a man you know about," Ulrich requested. "We don't have that long, but until the spring, I will show you everything that you can do." Taipan promised. Good enough. Chapter 93. Cold Forging. Air brushed across his face, tickling the stubble of his scalp as the blade passed within a few millimeters of his temple. Ulrich pushed forward, stabbing, trying desperately to take this hard-earned advantage and press it for victory. He'd spent 30 steps angling for this opening, and now that it had finally revealed itself, he meant to kill. His knife blade surged forward towards the almond-brown skin, soft flesh over the heart, ready to be parted. He lost his balance slightly. His target twisted, turning out of line with the stab, victory vanishing like smoke as he felt his wrist seized, pulled. The rotating body stealing his momentum and making it into a weapon against himself. His leading ankle, ever so slightly out of alignment, was not stable enough to resist the sweeping foot that cleared his leg from under him. The world rotated violently, and his back hit the ground hard enough to blast the breath out of him. "Hoff," he grunted. A booted foot stepped on his wrist, and a blade flashed over his throat even before he bounced back to the floor. He died. Again. "Fuck, I was so close," he told the room in accented Elvish, disappointed in himself. Taipan released her hold on him and reached down to pull him to his feet. They were both topless. Small ribbons of red scored their skin in a web. The knives were a type of soft, pliable wood wrapped in some thick moss that bled a sticky red sap when crushed. They showed every stroke that made contact in vivid crimson, which would not come off until treated with soap. "You were close, you forced a disadvantage on me. My slash was all I had to ward you away, and you evaded it to find a killing blow. Then you wasted it through over-eagerness. I should not have been able to throw you like that. Not if your root forward step was done correctly." Taipan explained his failing. She was right, he'd dicked it up. A gap in defenses as rare as frog fur, and he'd lost his composure, and been killed for it. He sighed his frustration away. It was still progress. 3 weeks ago, he'd never even have known there was a gap in her defenses. 2 months before that, and he'd have never been able to create it. Taipan moved like her namesake, fast, decisive, and aggressive. She came on with eye-blurring strikes that found holes in his guard like sand finds pockets in your shoes, and just as hard to keep out. In the 2.5 months of their Gitgud training, this was the closest thing to a victory Ulrich had squeaked out. He was getting better, to an extent he would not have believed. Idraz had told him that his feet were finally moving independently of his hands, and in coordination with them a few days ago. It was a high watermark for Ulrich. The swordmaster and once head of the royal guard had come through his wounds relatively sound, minus an eye, plus a few more scars to his already impressive collection. His maiming hadn't slowed the old elf noticeably to Ulrich. To the man himself, though, he'd been hurt badly enough to have passed on the role of leadership of the guard to an elf named Chorik, to assume a more predominant role in training of the next generation of Irielan warriors. His people had need of him. The loss of the Hunters' Guild and those brave souls within had hurt badly. All through the winter, the fortress had seen a dramatic focus, like a held breath as the elves poured themselves into their preparations, as they strove to reach greater martial heights to offset the loss of their brethren. Ulrich had thought them in high gear before. That was a pale thing compared to how they were now. Training literally never stopped. Every hour of every day, the pavilions of training dummies sang out a staccato of blows against imagined foes. Where before they'd been sanding off the rust, they were now intent on grinding away every iota of softness from themselves. The attack on Irielhos without warning, an unthinkable assault on the heartland, goaded them, drove them headlong into a frenzy. They threw themselves at one another on the practice floor with a violence that inspired awe. Pecking orders amongst the warriors were redrawn from scratch as talents that had merely lacked proper motivation exploded from apparent hibernation. In particular was the youngest royal guardsman, a fast friend to Ulrich named Christ, whom Ulrich had dubbed Christ for his gluttony for punishment. Christ was carving his way up through the ranks, one bruised, frustrated opponent at a time. Ulrich had gotten his ass handed to him at least a couple of dozen times by the young warrior. No longer the friendly practice sessions, Christ didn't have time to humor Ulrich's lack of skill. He went full throttle right from the start, no more sandbagging from that kid. Anything less was a loss to his people of a warrior who could have grown stronger but held back. So Ulrich took his beatings like a man, and Christ gave him a pat on the back and an attaboy, and returned to kicking the shit out of everybody who stood in front of him. Idraz considered it a good thing for everyone involved, even the more experienced fighters who managed to hold the younger swordsman off. "None there are who learn faster than those with a razor at their necks," was the old master's summary. Baldert lived. Barely. The once vibrant elf, a picture of the Irielan prime, was a shadow of his former glory. His wives were also depleted, having given much of themselves to hold off the bane. Long after, most would have written off his life and turned to vengeance. It spoke volumes about the relationship between the ladies and their lord. The very fact that they had risked being destroyed by the bane themselves was telling. The insidious stuff corrupted its victims into more of itself, which would then go on to infect others, meaning just being in proximity to Boldarty had been incredibly dangerous to them. But stay close they had and continued to do so. Rarely had they left the convalescent Lord of Iriel without at least 2 in attendance. Ulrich had been able to meet with his royal hosts on a few occasions. Weak, sickened, and frail though he was, Baldert had lost none of his humor. "Ulrich, so good to see you. I would rise from my bed to greet you, but I hear I had better not, or you'll stuff my daughter into it before I could return," had been the elf's first words to him on their meeting. Vedir turned to bathe and whispered loudly enough for the room to hear, "I told you we should just let the bane have him. Just cast the dust and be done with it. I said it will at least be quieter around the fortress." Brief though it was heartening to see Taipan's father alive and on the mend, diminished though he was. Shaw had assured Ulrich that the Lord of Iriel would recover his full strength. It was only a matter of time. Unfortunately, as it was frequently with the elves, that time could easily be measured in decades. Ariel was still vulnerable. The four pillars that held it above the fray were reduced, fragile, and unable to sally out to bring ruin to their enemies, as once would have been the case. Ulrich had to wonder if the enemy had known that Baldert's wives would show such dedication to him as to weaken themselves in a nearly impossible attempt to save him. Or perhaps they had hoped to catch all the royals together and employ the weapon on all of them. That seemed optimistic. Whatever the case, it didn't change the final outcome. War was coming in a few short weeks. It would largely not be affected by the actions of the Iriellan royal family, the most potent individuals that the Orlathrum could muster. Bright Eyes estimated 5 to 6 before the snows melted back to allow army movements in the plains and lowland forests, the most likely attack angles. Travel up the Zealous was closed. The Zealosin had fortified the banks of the river and turned it into a death trap. Floods in the spring turned the river into a nightmare for transport anyway. Tree trunks and other flotsam, carried in currents unlike anything Ulrich had ever heard of, would turn barges, rafts, and even warships into kindling. Hunters abroad and scouts from the allied forces of the Orlathrum Confederation had observed movements of the outermost towns and strongholds of Prespang. Movements that suggested something had gone wrong. The influx of supplies was halted, redistributed, and troops were being deployed with a suggestion of confused orders. A wrench had been thrown into the plan. Ulrich liked to think his name was on that wrench, but was aware that was probably him being overly egocentric. Bright Eyes had his work cut out for him, a child leading a nation into war. A gifted child trained his entire life for this moment, but a child still. He had, however, been handed a great lever with which to turn the situation to his favor. The attack on Irielhos had, ironically, weakened the position of the aggressors. What was intended to be a decapitating strike that accompanied a coup de grace of overwhelming military might in strategically advantageous positions was, instead, a glorified assassination attempt. A failed one. The Golden Crown, as he was referred to by his people somewhat humorously, though respectfully, had revealed to Ulrich the depth of the flaw in their enemy's decision to launch the raid. They spent 15 of the 17 mages sent against us. 14 adepts and an archmage died to achieve what amounts to a bloodying of our nose. Father is hurt, but lives, and they shiver with fear, knowing that the blood moon will return. Not to mention, my mothers will have their strength back in a few more months, and I have never seen my dam so angry. I have heard rumors from relatives when I visited her homelands in Melond that she was called the Golden Beast. I have never seen that side of her, but there have been none who were willing to withstand her. Thanks in great part to you, Glade Chief, we have broken the greatest part of their magical power and deprived them of the artifact that allowed all of this to be undertaken. Just as Ulrich had failed his thrust against Taipan, so had Prespang failed their attempt at a mortal blow by being too aggressive to balance their attack. They took a huge hit to their most potent mage core and gave up the utterly crucial advantage of their ability to circumvent Orlathrum's counterintelligence wards. With those back in place, Orlathrum was, once again, a black box, impenetrable. Ulrich's declared intent to take a counterstroke to Prosper, made known to the royals, was greeted with support but not necessarily enthusiasm. Bright Eyes viewed it as unnecessary and too great an extension. Idra thought he wasn't ready, and Baldert feared that the absence of the ruling lord for too long would cause even more instability in the creatures roaming the plateau. The canopy seethed, according to scouting reports. Taipan deferred her judgment, saying only, "I will go where you go." Breaking away from his musings, Ulrich clapped his hands loudly, announcing to his bodyguard and trainer, "Lunchtime," before reaching for his shirt, tossing the tall, lithe elf her own clothes as well. They dressed, Ulrich in a replacement for his destroyed robes. Taipan was in her normal hunter's attire, as she had been every day since the attack. It would seem she had decided that she would be ready to intercept assassins at all times now. It was some kind of comforting to Ulrich, knowing that she was on her toes. Ulrich considered briefly his own mottled hide before he pulled the shirt on and donned the overrobe. The scars, not so much scars as completely regrown skin, had faded to the pale default of his natural tone, The more minor burns had healed without further intervention, eventually peeling to reveal healthy flesh beneath. Hair was growing back in, finally. His stamina, drained substantially by the entire process, had recovered to full over the first weeks following his release from the Arcanum. Every day since he'd spent training, at least 10 hours each day. Mornings he spent getting his ass beat by Taipan. Afternoons he spent in study with an unexpected tutor of the arcane, the very instructor Gotha who had led his children's classes in Irielan culture, trade, and custom. True to her word, Taipan had shown him most of the ways she knew to kill a man. Some 100 Vardan years' worth of practice, killing monsters and men she drilled into him. Nothing was off limits. In throat jabs, eye gouges, some way of hitting the liver that sent slivers of molten pain through him, kidney punches, and more, Taipan instructed him. Mostly through direct experience, she started at the top of the list of dirty tricks and went through it alphabetically. He had to wonder at a mind that contained so many diverse, creative ways to inflict pain and mortal injury. Then she introduced him to knife work. A nasty business, as he'd suspected ever since seeing Bright Eyes bloody to the shoulder in monkey guts. The stripes of red on their bodies, now hidden by their clothes, showed the reality of a knife fight. When two combatants were of approximately the same skill, there were rarely winners, just different times of death. It was good to learn, though. It taught Ulrich the power of extreme aggression and sleight of hand. To overwhelm the opponent with violence, inflicting savage wounds through small, efficient, highly leveraged movements in the places that bled most heavily. To hide the true angle of attack behind a feint or distraction. Against his armor, many of the techniques were not as effective, but against a less heavily protected enemy, a dagger was incredibly dangerous. It was also easily concealed and quickly drawn, capable of inflicting a mortal wound in a single moment of lapsed attention. An Irielan combat drill involved an 8x8 square grid of warriors standing at attention, hands to their sides. The trainee walked into the grid and had to retrieve a colored strip of cloth that was tied to one of the grid members' arms. Every 10 or so seconds, the grid shuffled to rearrange the positions of the warriors. Of the 64 warriors, 8 had blunt wooden knives secreted on their person. They would attempt to murder the trainee by surprise as they maneuvered through the grid, and were not gentle with their encouragements that you pay attention. Sometimes the person with the strip on their arm would be one of the 8, sometimes not. It taught you to keep your head on a fucking swivel real quick. Taipan made no bones about her true combat role being silent murder from stealth. She elevated moving into a blind spot and staying there, even when the objective was moving and searching into an art form. When she was on her game, not distracted or underestimating her enemy to a criminal degree, Ulrich could see why her former brethren respected her. Speaking of those, gone was her awkwardness around the other Irielan warriors, gone was the longing to join them. She had thrown that away when she committed herself to her new role, to her new name. They were more comfortable in dealing with her too. No longer was her moniker a source of veiled insult or a thing for joking. She wore her name as proudly as she had her old one, in some ways more so. This name she had earned herself. He considered his time spent with Taipan as they strolled towards the cafeteria on the 6th level of Irielhos, the location of his new apartments, after his old had been more or less turned to ashen char. Taipan had a gift for hunting humans, for better or worse, and she tried to impart to Ulrich, with mixed success. He wasn't as bonelessly agile as she was, he lacked her coordination and flexibility. What he could do was move faster, in a straight line. Where she might weave between pieces of cover, he would, in a single linear dash, cross the intervening distance. She had told him, with some pride, like a teacher praising their student's growth, that he had a frightening instinct for when to close a gap, becoming suddenly threatening. He took advantage of this to shift into and out of ranges, to feint and invade the space of his opponent, unbalancing them. Ulrich would never forget the terror-inspiring charge of the Forest Lord, raw power moving with incredible fury to crush its prey beneath it. He let that image guide him in his developing combat style. It also played into his other strength, battle magic. Ulrich was one of the rare beings that could use aggressive spells in the heat of a fight. It gave him the flexibility to pressure opponents at range and in close quarters, finding and exploiting their vulnerabilities from a wide variety of directions. He had learned that it was vanishingly uncommon to be gifted at both. Most had to choose, develop the body, channel their core's power into their skills, and mature their combat abilities, as was the case for most melee classes, or learn the lore, the techniques to externalize their mana into the elemental spell forms for evocation, as was the case for mage classes. Ulrich had both types of classes. His body was already naturally weaponized, and his core was as potent as could be expected of an unawakened core. The learning and experience of his previous life filled the gap in his knowledge to allow him to utilize magic as a mage with far more experience would. Taipan assured him that while developing both talents was going to be time-consuming and difficult, he would eventually hybridize his classes into a battle mage class, depending on his specialization and emergent style. It hadn't happened yet. For 2.5 months, ever since being nearly killed by the assault mage, Ulrich had strived single-mindedly to grow these various skills as quickly as possible. As he'd learned this morning, despite his failure, Ulrich was turning a corner. He was becoming a problem, even for drastically more skilled opponents. All he needed was time. Sadly, he was nearly out of that. Spring was on the horizon. As his steps absently mirrored those taken at nearly identical times for over 60 days unbroken, he noted the lack of daggers in the winter air. The grip of the season was weakening. All too soon, and Ulrich would get to see what the revival of the deep wood had to offer, if he was still around to witness it. When the snows melted and the torrential downpours of the early part of the season of rebirth ended, making roads passable, it was almost certain that war would come again to Orlathrem. Iriel would spearhead this conflict. The deep wood was dripping bloody thoughts. Ulrich shared them. He thought to move out before the snows were gone, to get a jump on the hostilities. What Ulrich wanted to accomplish was what his enemies had wanted for their own campaign, to destroy the leadership. He wanted to infiltrate the territory of Prespang and find whoever it was that was guiding events down the inevitable track they had followed. Some force had seized control of the northern city-states and had unified the Otherkin into a cohesive force. That same power had maneuvered Prosper's merchant lords into funding the effort and into utilizing their resources to obtain a war chest to attempt to crush the less numerous forces of Orlathrem. The fucker had also attempted genocide with a dirty bomb, the Bane, and had a hit taken out on Ulrich, resulting in his own self being halfway to charbroiled. So yes, Ulrich had taken the conflict personally. Chapter 94, Awakening. It was a curious thing, he pondered, sitting at a table with his shadow, other warriors attending their meals as well, in Irielan customary silence, the twists and turns he'd taken on this journey in a new world. He'd been convinced that he would be living in his forest home forever, 5 months ago. He still did want that, in part. It was just that there were people out there determined to be sons of bitches, and they wanted him dead. The former engineer was not a naturally violent man, a bit inclined to be asocial, a devout enjoyer of peaceful solitude, but not a psychotic misanthrope bent on killing everyone around him. So his determination to find and murder an indeterminate number of people to death was an unexpected trajectory for his life to follow. Events had their own momentum, though. They carried him along with an inertia that was too great to ignore. He couldn't bury his head in the leaves of his forest home simply because he was conflict-averse. He couldn't indulge that part of himself any longer. Ulrich was lord of the ancient glade. He was a person of interest. Inevitably, there would be those who believed him either an asset or an enemy. If they were decent people, as the elves of Iriel had proven to be, they would recognize that Ulrich fundamentally just wanted to get along and make with the peaceful coexistence. Some others would want his territory for their own. Those got the instinctive need to protect and dominate, all under his purview, all hot and bothered. The Lord instinct, a gift, a curse, a side effect of being recognized by the land itself as being a guardian of a certain domain. Ulrich didn't know how or why it had happened. He'd done not much other than just try not to get killed, to survive in a vast wilderness. But it had. Baldert had explained that there were conditions that he'd met, criteria that indicated to the land a degree of fitness. It sounded to Ulrich like metaphysical, magical horseshit. But the Akashic record, the two-way connection between beings who lived on Varda and Varda, the world itself, did not lie. If the mystical status said he was the lord of the ancient glade, then, by the twins dancing above, he was. Whether he wanted to be was irrelevant. When some threat to his glade arose, some challenge to his rule over it, the instinct rose up with sweet whispers of savagery. It drove him to be more aggressive, to meet his enemies with a ferocity he doubted he could have managed with a psyche molded by the softer, gentler upbringing of his prior life. Ulrich had been reforged, not reincarnated. He kept his memories of that past world, the kind people who'd done their best to raise him, the loving sister he'd lost, the few precious friends he'd managed to alienate with his self-destructive isolation and depression, the work that had come to dominate his entire existence, consuming him to the point that he'd forgotten why he bothered doing that work to begin with. It was not the sort of life that prepared the mind to be immersed in a mystical land of mages, greater beasts, and warriors of impossible ability. There were other alterations in his disposition. Sitting in his status were traits like warrior's instinct, a manifestation of the changes in him caused by his kill or be killed life in the glade. Beasts up on the plateau had turned out to be larger, stronger, more lethal variants of their brethren in the forests below. Contending with them had spurred Ulrich's perceptions and tendencies to adapt to that environment. Humans were nothing if not adaptable. Thanks to that trait, when things got rough, Ulrich's brain went all liquid-cooled. He didn't panic. As he would have in the before, he didn't lose focus. Instead, the world went all hard edges and sharp contrasts, and he felt like the happenings around him were underwater, slow. His warrior class unlocking had indicated that it was a common class trait for the combat-oriented classes, but his already having it had unlocked a subsequent trait, sort of a fast-forward in progression. He honestly didn't understand the classes, the status, or the Akashic nonsense. He didn't have to, though. Keep it simple, stupid. You don't need to know everything, so long as you could make it useful, the engineer's creed. As Ulrich stood, his shadow rose to join his side. Together they strode purposefully through the fortress city of Irielhos, all clamour and bustle to find the next catalyst of Ulrich's metamorphosis. Instructor Gotha. With Baldarti's wives unwilling to leave his side, Ulrich needed a new teacher. The only wrinkled, white-haired and most tellingly bearded elf Ulrich had ever met had volunteered himself. Gotha was the elven equivalent of a pacifist. He did not believe in bringing harm to any sentient being. The destruction of a thinking being and the knowledge it held was anathema to the elf in these days. The Bane had changed that. When word had gotten out that their enemies had used the forbidden weapon, the Akashic soul poison, many restraints had gone out with the dishwater. Gotha's refusal to contribute to the death of another had transitioned smoothly to, here is how you mold Calum, to expand the air inside of a warrior's lungs and shred those lungs overnight. As Taipan was to the ways of infiltrating and hunting men in the dark, Gotha was to the ways of shaping mana to destructive purpose. The elf had previously used this knowledge to instruct his students in the defense against such things. Not any more, kiddos, the gloves were off. Ulrich's lessons with the dragons of Iriel were introductory primers, fundamentals of control, theory, and form for mana. Gotha's lessons turned those fundamentals into weapons. Only the elf's advanced age prevented him from being an absolutely unholy terror, as he had been for centuries in his youth. Gotha was the blood moon of an era bygone. At a ripe 984, the near-millennial elf was unable to muster the stamina to wield his own power. Or rather, he could do so exactly once more before the energies consumed his body. Apparently, that was the fate of the Archmage, the wizardly version of dying of old age. Slowly, steadily, the ancient mage who had previously passed his twilight years teaching children the common truths of their sylvan world broke down Ulrich's casting approaches and rebuilt them into a more methodical, precise paradigm that drastically improved his efficiency. Each of those base spells that was not at their final rank reached it, their Akashic indication of V demonstrating that each spell form had been lifted to its greatest potential. The wizened elf frequently passed hours as he stroked his beard and watched as the far younger man struggled to adopt the cleaner, almost ritualistic mental routines of elven casting. Like creating a vast tree, first the intent, the roots, beginning the spell with its end foremost. Next the trunk, the mechanics of the mana, its shapings and their connections to his core, the specific threads of purpose that bound it into a specific architecture, the spell form. Lastly, the branches reaching high, energizing the framework with his core, and casting it out according to his will. Slow going, but Ulrich was a good student and the elf a patient teacher. With a bemused smile, Ulrich recalled how his lessons in magic with the wizened elf had begun. 8 weeks earlier, breath left Ulrich's chest as his body drank in the heated water. Steam roiling in the room, as it so often did, made a cloak of imagined privacy, cutting him off from the rest of the world. There was only heat-soaked bliss. Eyes closed, he reclined to his usual posture, preparing to lose attachment to his worldly concerns. A disturbance in the water next to him marked Taipan's entry into the baths. One eye gently opened to take in her soft curves and rippling musculature, flesh-made art. His languishing smile vanished when his senses were assaulted by a bony ass, coated in dried, shriveled leather, once browned skin sun-dried into a pale parchment, dotted by liver spots. The drawn, wrinkled hide dropped into the water, and Ulrich suddenly found Instructor Gotha, ribs standing proudly, shoulder bones jutting out from the water, beard floating, a scant half-meter away from him. "Jag!" Ulrich's voice elevated as this insult to his expectations reclined. On his other side, his shadow lowered herself gracefully into the water, chuckling. "Glade, Chief, you should sing higher notes more often. You have a lovely pitch," she commented. The aged elf appeared as a corpse in his contented sprawl, arms resting on the smooth stone edges of the bath. Water lapped gently at his withered flesh. "I have considered events, Glade Chief." The dry, pinched lips uttered, eyes still closed. Like some sick necrophiliac puppeteer had taken over the time-wasted corpse next to him. "It would seem that the crimes of our enemies are too great to ignore. I am too far gone to take matters into mine own hands," the elf admitted regretfully. "But you have a surfeit of talent and, as you have proven, the will to strive to manifest that ability. You also saved my Lord Boldert, my great-great-grand-nephew. In light of this, I have taken it upon myself to offer my wealth of knowledge, my considerable mastery of arcane workings, beyond those of any still living in Iriel, to train you in magecraft," Instructor Gotha demanded. Technically, it was an opportunity, a choice, but Ulrich had watched enough classical hololives to recognize an offer he couldn't refuse. "I see," he replied without enthusiasm. Thanks? No. My apologies." Ulrich restarted sincerely. "Thank you for your generous offer, Instructor Gotha. It would be a privilege to accept your tutelage. I will give my greatest attention to your wisdom," Ulrich said, pushing past his reluctance. His magic lessons with Shaw, Bathe, and Vedir had been curtailed. They were recovering from their own depletion alongside their husband and would not leave him in any case. Too close had they come to the final separation to be willing to part from his company for any non-critical reason. According to any Acer who spoke on the matter, it was universally agreed upon that Instructor Gotha was an institution all to himself. He was ancient, even by elven standards. Baldar T had installed Ulrich into the Elder Elf's lessons towards Irielan children, partially as a joke, and partially because Ulrich really was more akin to a child than to an adult, at least in terms of worldly knowledge of Varda, and Gotha was the best, most knowledgeable teacher who could be found in Iriel. That the time-worn elf was dry as all the deserts combined was beside the point. He could laugh about it now. The ancient bearded scholar had cornered Ulrich while he was in the baths. Ulrich had barely sat down in the exquisite waters, but before a scrawny, pale, liver-spotted form slipped into the space next to him. Like somebody had dropped a bearded skeleton into the water at his side. Ulrich had not screamed like a girl, no matter what Taipan had to say about it. Ever since, he'd spent his afternoons in the Arcaneum, attending lessons on crafting mana into weapons and on turning aside those craftings, rendering them inert. Mage duels were a complex thing, every bit as fraught as a knife fight. A mage could interfere with another mage's casting, but not the internal workings of their magic. Counterspelling had to be done after they had externalized whatever working they had prepared. That meant that the defensive mage was always reacting and was always a step behind. In Idra's terms, you granted the opponent complete initiative, the first step always in dueling this way. Instructor Gotha had insisted upon Ulrich's mastery of this skill nevertheless. You are never guaranteed to have the advantage, Glade Chief. What opportunity had you to anticipate your assassination attempt not so long ago? It is better to learn to turn a losing position against an enemy than to attempt to always have the initiative, an impossibility on the battlefield. Gotha scolded gently. By tearing apart your enemy's spell forms, you steal from them their energy, you drain their reserves, at comparably far less loss from your own. Counterspelling, Ektyler, is analogous to a magical parry of physical weapons. The point is not to hold initiative, it is to turn aside a stroke that would slay you and, perhaps, create the opportunity to riposte. Now, attend. At which point the elder wizard had tossed Ulrich across the amphitheater stage with a burst of wind, with not a whisker of a change of appearance. Instructor Gotha didn't gesture, didn't speak, didn't so much as twitch when he cast. Ulrich never actually knew when the Archmage was casting. It was extremely unsettling, especially when it became clear to Ulrich that he could weave multiple spells simultaneously while doing something else, like showing Ulrich how to inscribe ritual runes without apparent effort. Ulrich had once, under extreme duress, and without actually thinking about it, dual cast. He'd managed to absorb the heat, the incendiaire of that dickhat pyromancer's spell, sending back to him as a set of enhanced cinder pearls, while creating the flow of his guided lightning bolt. Subsequent attempts caused both spells to fail. Taipan told him such things were not uncommon. A warrior could perform feats in combat that were outside of their ability in practice. Survival instincts were a potent force. She went on to explain that Instructor Gotha had taught Shaw and was an order of magnitude greater in mastery than any of her mothers. That statement did nothing to decrease his amazement when the wrinkled bag of bones in front of him conjured a globe of each basic elemental mana and then did something that wrapped them up together into a shield of pure magical force that shredded anything Ulrich tried to do to penetrate it. Seriously, at the smug old bastard's insistence, Ulrich tried everything. He couldn't even get the shield to ripple. One of their first lessons together had seen Ulrich demonstrating his small arsenal of offensive magics. The frowning bearded elf looked at them and declared Ulrich to be a gifted child, and had praised him like one just before showing Ulrich a version of those spells that compared as a field mouse to a wolverine. Very good little Timmy. Now see how the grown-ups do it. Goth had actually been far more impressed when he learned about Ulrich's stone wall track and the multi-layered air barrier. The first for its finesse, a degree of mana manipulation that was surprising for Ulrich's comparative age. The second for its subtlety. Many mages would have simply cast a single spell and poured more of their mana into it, achieving nothing when overpowered so greatly. Ulrich had cast the same spell multiple times, taking advantage of the small amount of air between each barrier that would further soak up energy as he spread it out with each individual shield. Ulrich's engineering background had come to the rescue there. He was familiar with how to disperse and spread energy. He'd been making egg-drop devices, shock absorbers, and heat-shock-proofed metallic glasses since he was in upper school. 2 months of dedicated struggle saw Instructor Gotha telling him he had graduated from talented incompetence to marginal. Ulrich had grinned from ear to ear at this declaration right until he had a heart attack. 1 second, Ulrich was on cloud 9, the next, a twinge of something profoundly wrong cut him short. As of this last round of practice, 5 hours of grueling concentration, like enduring the engineering certification exams, in which he'd used every last iota of skill available to him. He'd earned Instructor Gotha's begrudging acknowledgement. Just about the time he was ready to turn to Taipan and boast, the first ripple went across his chest. He looked down at his shirt in surprise, looking for the switch that hit him just below the sternum, and saw nothing. Just then, another stab of pain radiated outward. As intense as a literal stab, his core felt like it was trying to punch its way out of him. His hand unconsciously went to grip a handful of his clothes, fabric twisting in his hand as he fought the tears out of his eyes. "Fuck," he yelled, surprising the 2 Iriellen next to him. His face probably described the situation better than his words. He was screwed up in pain as the next wave of pain rocked him. Mega fuck. Something's wrong, my chest is exploding. He grunted, trying to stay calm. Taipan got it first. Her eyes narrowed as she turned to Gotha, explaining while Ulrich focused on staying upright. It is his core. He has not awakened his core, and it has reached the limit for condensing unexpected mana. He is beginning to suffer mana resonances, she explained. Gotha had never scanned him. For some reason, that whole pickle had completely slipped Ulrich's mind. Shaw had warned him. Vedir and Bathe had warned him. Progressing in his talents for magic would naturally force his core toward critical mass. He'd taken himself right to the edge of what could, potentially, be a deadly transformation. The old man's crinkled eyes took on an unbelieving cast. "You are not awakened. How was I not told this?" cried the wizened instructor before he took hold of himself. Taipan looked shaken. It hadn't occurred to her that, at some point in the intervening months, no one had ever thought to mention that Ulrich's core might go boom. "Shall I be scanning each pupil to ensure that they aren't hiding necessary information now?" he muttered sarcastically before he got himself in order. "Ulrich, this is critical. You must begin circulating mana, immediately, cycling it through your core and throughout your body. Lady Bathe has taught you how to do this. Do it now, or you will burn yourself from the inside," Instructor Gotha ordered. Chapter 95. Siron touched. Unquestioning, Ulrich began to do just that. The pressure in his chest went away instantly, and the waves of pain stopped, as if he'd imagined them. He had not God's damned well imagined that. It hurt like the mother of all heartburn. "Did the waves of pain stop?" checked the elf, his arms crossed angrily. Ulrich merely nodded. He was getting his breath back from the constricting, flaring waves of core resonance. "Good. Be aware. This is a temporary measure, a stopgap. Once the mana instability has started, it cannot be halted. Your core is already at its limit for compressing and refining unexpected mana safely. What you are doing now is buying time by diffusing the mana throughout your body. That will not stop additional mana from being pulled into your system. Come, we must leave the Arcanum, and you must not return to any place with a heavy manosphere until you awaken," the Archmage said, hustling him up the stairs. Taipan supported him from the other side, somewhat unnecessarily. He wasn't weak physically, he just had to concentrate to keep his mana cycling. Outside the amphitheater, away from the dense mana field inside, Ulrich immediately felt the difference. He continued to cycle his mana, but it no longer felt so urgent. He released a deep breath of relief. "That was far more abrupt than I was prepared for," he told the elves with forced levity. Neither was amused. Taipan was making an effort to remain steady, but Ulrich could see the small signs of her distress. He tried to suppress his own worry. "I cannot believe none thought to inform me that the Glade Chief was still unawakened. How? I have been near dozens, hundreds of human mages. None of them have your capacity or regenerative power. What in the deepest dungeons is going on here?" "Never mind, Glade Chief. Ulrich, excuse me, but I need to scan you," Gotha said, brooking no nonsense. His eyes flashed white and his expression shifted slightly. The old elf's hand started stroking his long beard, absently, eyes distant. "Mercy of the ancients," Gotha whispered, a small chip in his steady disposition. A considering glance took Ulrich in. They always did that. Whatever they saw, Ulrich didn't have enough context to understand what it was that was so disturbing. Gotha got over it soon enough. His businesslike aura returned. "You are truly gifted by the goddess of eternal watchfulness, Ulrich. That gift may be your undoing. You are deeper into the crisis than I knew. With so much mana running through your body, your core is under greater pressure than normal. Please tell me that my pupils have taught you about core awakening, since none of them bothered to inform me that this was on the horizon," the old wizard implored, thoroughly miffed at being left out of the loop. Here, Ulrich could give him good news. They did. Lady Bath focused most of her instruction on diffusing mana into my own body and in regulating the flow of mana through my core, in preparation for awakening. The circulation exercise is, more or less, exactly as she said it would be during the crisis. For the rest, it's been explained to me. I just wasn't prepared for how heavy the pressure would be. Ulrich explained, feeling the need to defend his tutors. Gotha nodded dismissively. Indeed, very well. I am afraid that, now that the moment has come, you must make a decision, Ulrich. Your core cries out for a direction, a maniform into which it can attune. Just as a greater beast metamorphs into one of several varieties, so too must those who develop their arcane capacity be transformed. Have you considered which harmony you will choose to attune? His mentor probed. Ulrich had. He'd thought long and hard on it. He'd had little else he could do while he lay in that bed, considering every decision, every action that had led to his being there. He wouldn't change a thing. This, his second life, was to be a riot of joy, violence, conflict, and struggle. The choice was made long ago, Master Gotha. I'm not sure that it was ever entirely mine to make. Such is life. I will go out into the wilds today and challenge the storm. Ulrich told the formerly pacifist Archmage. He saw understanding in the eyes of the eldest Irielen. Here was a man who had witnessed loss on a scale Ulrich could not fathom, could not begin to appreciate. Instructor Gotha was a man who did not need or want others to have that appreciation. He knew the cost and had lived his life to try to ensure that none of his people would ever pay it again. Ulrich felt sympathy for the older elf and hoped he could do as the old man hoped, protect his children. Today is best. To wait longer gains you nothing and risks much. Very well, Ulrich Glade Chief. May the heartwood protect, the skies provide, and the roots guide as you become a true mage. Remember, the manner is a thing that is, but nothing must necessarily be. All is possibility. Your will, that is what creates the future. As seeds become saplings, I hope to observe your growth on the morrow. Spoke Gotha, the words sounding like something of a ritual, an old one. The old mage departed then, unwilling to drag things out. I am going with you, Taipan declared. That was not an option. Call it a premonition, but Ulrich had a feeling in his guts that any living thing close to what he was about to experience wasn't going to make it out alive. That didn't comfort him greatly since he wasn't going to have much better odds himself. Sorry, Taipan, this is a solo run. Don't worry about it. I sort of did this once already and turned out just fine. You guys never got to see the awesome scars I used to have in the before. Ulrich joked, carefully not mentioning that he'd been legally dead for a hot minute. She was going to argue, because of course she was, but Ulrich stomped on it. The last thing he needed was worrying about her safety while he was up to his eyeballs in whatever the hell was about to happen. Taipan, this isn't an option. If you're around, I'll lose focus, and that will be the end of that. The best thing you can do is be safe and sound while I bring this Watcher's gift to order. You've done a near complete 180 in the last couple of months. You're not going to blow all that away now, are you? Ulrich asked, being unfair to her. Sometimes you have to play dirty, especially when feelings are involved. She knew it too, going by her scowl. He'd seen far less of that of late. This time, though, her discontent wasn't based on his humanity or her own perceived slighting by the world itself. She was angry because she cared. He wasn't so sure how to deal with that. Maybe they could sit down and figure it out when he got back. He gave her his most confident smile. I'll be back late. Don't wait up. We'll clear tomorrow morning's schedule, though, eh? He wagged his eyebrows up and down to exaggerate the implication. It was her father all over which drove her nuts. Scoffing, she rolled her eyes. Fine, but I will not be getting your breakfast for you. You will walk with your own legs. I am a shadow, not a dinner cart. Ancestors watch over your path, Ulrich. He was proud of how well she hid her unease. Truly, she'd grown as a person. Ulrich had lost his hesitation about leaving his back to her. He trusted her completely now, which was odd for him. Maybe he'd grown as a person too. Unlikely, he was still an asshole. He turned then and strode from the hall out into the pavilion. Once in the cold air of the fading winter afternoon, Ulrich broke out into a jog. He hadn't been fooling around with Gotha, he really had already made this decision. He didn't know how he'd managed to forget this day was coming. Blame his tunnel vision on trying to prevent ever ending up in a hospital bed again from a random pedophile coat wearing mage's fireball. Regardless, his mind had been made up long ago about which direction to go. The fortress blurred around him as he ran. Daylight was running out. He had to get out of the city. What came next had to be where no one else could get hurt. He started to weave through stalls, hurdling carts and jumping thicker crowds, using the building walls as springboards to traverse the usual city hustle of wartime preparation. He came to a balcony rail, beyond which was the forest far below. He jumped the rail, snagging it with a hand to redirect his momentum, swinging down onto the pavilion below. His feet hit together, and he rolled, stealing the impact to reduce the strain on his knees. He did it again, jumping the rail, swinging to the level below, and then again, until he stood in the abandoned elven capital, her people hidden away. Now Ulrich turned on the speed, racing away through arboreal sky bridges. He knew where he wanted to be. He'd spotted it from high above. There was a bluff that overlooked a small lake. It had a great view of the forest around, the distant mountains, and, through a small window of leafless branches, the curve of a sliver of the Zealous River. It was a fine place, not too far either, only a half an hour's run. Ulrich took a small chance jumping down from the city built into the trees, falling some 20 meters to the soft forest floor below. He crouched as he landed, his legs absorbing the fall, knees bent. Easy. He'd always wanted to do that. Taking off at a dead sprint, Ulrich blurred between trunks, suppressing the urge to laugh. He'd never have been able to do this again in his old world. He'd gained so much since coming to this world. It was a gift, was Varda. Nothing was perfect, though. As he came to the top of the bluff, granite beneath his feet, grey and grainy, broken stone at the base marking the passage of time, he considered the problem, panting as he recovered from the intense run. The problem was the people. More specifically, the problem was the people in charge. Ulrich had no doubt that most of the folk of Prespang were honest. Decent people just trying to live their lives. Just like the Orlathrum. Somehow, a sequence of events had been set into motion that had conspired to drive these peoples into conflict. Someone had something to gain from creating grudges that lasted generations. The current situation was like a boil, an infection that had to be lanced to draw the worst of the sickness out. That didn't treat the cause, though. No, for that, a deeper medicine was going to be needed. Ulrich had decided, lying there screaming through the stroke of a brush on ruined flesh, that if no one else would do it, he would be the cure for what ailed this world, at least for what he was able to fix. A small group of wealthy, powerful men, leading others to sacrifice them at the altar of their own greed. He could sleep well at night if all it took to stop so much meaningless suffering was to turn those few into ash. Peace, unfortunately, wasn't in the cards, not for him. If he'd wanted peace, he should have minded his own business all those days ago. Should have let those animals take a beaten elf child to do who knows what. He couldn't. He couldn't ignore the pain of a child. He couldn't ignore the war of annihilation carried out against a people who loved life so much that they'd devoted an entire subculture to becoming the swords and shields that would defend the rest. He couldn't stand aside while these deep woods folk who had shown him kindness, him, an ages-old enemy of their kin, now grieved over the slain. Friends and lovers of centuries were murdered in their homes, crippled by the scores by an attack of incredible savagery. He couldn't forgive the Bane. No, Ulrich had thought about what he wanted from life, about what he was prepared to do to live as he saw fit. Ulrich had decided what he needed to become. He suppressed a smile when he thought about those foolish children running through the storm, daring the skies to punish them. An insane gamble, bravery born of ignorance, and Ulrich had drawn the Joker all those years ago, as he seemed destined to do at every cut of the deck. There'd never been any other choice, had there? It had always been the lightning. Ulrich Einar was drawn to it, and it to him. His mind relaxed, and he circulated his mana, feeling the unfamiliar weight of it. There was a resistance now that alternated with wildness. At times resisting his pushes, at others moving as if driven by a buffeting wind. As he'd been told to do, Ulrich began to attune his core to Kiran, the mana that reflected the electromagnetic force of this strange world. Both the same as his old world and not. The essential ideas were similar. Similar enough that it came to his call easily. Ulrich's core rippled as the unexpected mana within began to resonate with the concentration of lightning inside him. He closed his eyes and brought his focus to bear. He was tired, both physically and mentally. This would have happened at the end of the day spent training. Not fresh after breakfast, no, sir. That isn't how the dice spun for him. But it wouldn't matter. This was a matter of willpower and concentration. He had those in spades. Chiron chased itself endlessly, always dissatisfied with Chiron, always seeking a balance that was ever so slightly never to be found. Ulrich could sympathize. He'd spent one life on dissatisfaction. The trick was to enjoy the imbalance, to ride the currents as they came. He couldn't control the waves. They would roll in uncaring whether he was there or not. He had learned instead to only worry about how he was going to ride them, to take them as they came. Chiron could learn a thing or two from him, he thought humorously. The next step was to form a shell of his own mana, expelling it even as he controlled the flow inside. Lessons from Veda in controlling elemental forms helped him direct the energy to his mental image of a sphere around his body, isolating him from the wild mana around. At first he felt nothing. The shell of energy was incomplete. Slowly he closed the gaps, molding it, spreading Chiron into an even coat. For some reason, imagining a conductive metal shell, the Gaussian flux equations dictating the interaction of the field to cancel itself within the shell, assisted his concentration greatly. There was a violet flash as the shell manifested, and Ulrich stopped feeling any of the gradually adding pressure as the external world was being held at bay by his barrier. Thunder rumbled distantly. Ulrich's eyes snapped open. Thunder? In the winter? He couldn't stop now. Concentrating, Ulrich began to cycle Chiron from his core into his body, making sure it remained completely internalized. He had to replace all the volatile, unaspected mana within his body with Chiron. He suffused his body with it, pushing the electrical magic into his tissues, forcing unaspected mana to either match this frequency or be ejected. He had that oddly not quite hurting, but not right sensation of holding an electric fence radiating through his bones, and forced his eyes shut again. As the shell completed, a cold gust blasted into his body forcefully enough to cause him to take a step to regain his balance. Rolling thunder shook the ground. Ulrich concentrated harder. Slowly his muscles drank in the energy he provided, then his organs, then his very bones. So slowly he replaced the resonant mana with Chiron. He'd disposed of quite a bit of wild mana in the process. Brightness greater than the falling twins flashed his closed eyes. Sound filled the air immediately, a sizzling crack that was followed by a boom that shook his body. More wind now, coming from unpredictable directions. Ulrich's eyes opened again. Nobody had mentioned this. Shaw's description said the awakening process was completely an internal thing, a matter of focus and training, like juggling. The skies had blackened, thunderheads raced high above, silver lances crossed the clouds. Their cries followed them, tolling the atmosphere with spent power. Ulrich watched as one bolt became two became a dozen. As the cycling energy inside him built, became purer, unified itself in an eternal chase, so did the frequency of the lightnings above grow. Ulrich felt it way up there inside those clouds. Chiron. Wild. Unlimited. Free to race back to itself. It beckoned to the force inside his core, called to itself. It challenged, and his resonating core beat a pulse in harmony with it. The arrogance of a mortal creature to call lightning and try to remain separate from it. Chiron reached for him, to take him into its flow. An arc as thick as an oak tree parted the darkened sky and dropped on top of him. Sound vanished. So did sight. Ulrich was nearly scoured from existence. There was only the raging torrent of violet light driving against his shell, circulating, diving into his core, trying to shatter him, trying to take his feeble irrelevance and make it as brilliantly powerful as itself. Trying to help him. He was a child again, running between the safety of a shelter and the tree. He felt the touch of the storm, felt its hunger. It didn't understand this weak, lonely creature. Nothing was ever alone. All the universe came paired. Here, come and see. Without feeling the any passage of time, Ulrich was somehow looking down on this strange new home of his. Clouds spun, or at least they would have had not the whole world been frozen. There, above the clouds, reaching into the eternal dark of space, was a vast web of lightning. It hummed a sound beyond the understanding of a human. Ulrich knew he was looking at Chiron itself. Not the name for a form of mana. No, he was looking at the god, the sentient force that was the consciousness of that mana. A great sprite, connecting eternity to the flesh of Varda, it danced, bridging the cosmos. He felt it, across every storm, weaving through every cloud, sometimes incandescent, mostly invisible, riding fields of might-be's, the potential for things to join together, the pain of separation. Saran was all of those things. It was beautiful. He burned to be part of it, to be it. But he had things to do, people who needed him to hang around. He had connections of his own now. It hurt, having to turn aside from this unity, to remain separate. Hurt like nothing he'd ever thought he could feel inside him. Not yet. One day he would come back. Not yet. Images flashed through him, faster than he could consciously grasp, but instilling themselves into his fading will. Of bright eyes holding the mask Ulrich had carved, joy on his childish face. Of Idra's, hard-faced but gently guiding him through his failures to walk. Of Baldurt smiling with his wives. Of Christ grinning as they strove to improve. Of Serlich's stern gaze, the hunter who'd given his life to guide his kin into the unknown. Of Taipan, her scowling emerald eyes hiding her concern. Not yet. Memory flooded back into him, and he stood where he had been from the beginning, atop the bluff. His senses had returned, clouds were dissipating above. He smelt ozone and fire. Looking around, Ulrich saw what came of rejecting the flow, of separating oneself recklessly. Ulrich witnessed the folly of trying and failing to chain lightning. Trees obliterated, smoking, blackened scars on the granite in some places, glowing glass in others. The shell he'd created was gone. It had served a purpose when he'd made it, but it was trying to isolate him, and Saran did not isolate. It bridged gaps. Ulrich felt the mana inside his core, the living pulse of it racing endlessly in its need to find itself. Gone was the uncertainty, the desire of his mana to become something. Now all was lightning. He'd awakened. An unsteady breath escaped him. This wasn't how it had been described. Never a religious man, he had no trouble whatsoever reconciling what he'd seen with what he felt. That thing up there, it was real. He felt the faint edges of it, and it knew of him. It had welcomed him, had embraced him to bring him into its existence. Ulrich knew that if he'd accepted that, he'd be an elemental, a being of pure, conscious energy. It had been close. He'd never felt so part of everything in his whole life. So close, but not yet. On shaking legs, Ulrich started to make his way back to the fortress city of the Irielen. He didn't know what he was going to tell anyone. The experience had the feeling of one that would only be understood by someone who had been there, up above the clouds. He knew one thing. He owed the elves his life. If Ulrich had been taken up into that flow as he'd been before, isolated and alone, he'd have gone with it. Nothing of his humanity would have remained. He'd have joined the rest of Saran, part of the eternal lightning. There had been that truth in its existence, all things are connected or will be. To reject that and become separate was to be destroyed. Sooner or later. Chapter 96, Uncertainty Principle. Weary steps carried Ulrich along through the frozen forest floor. The last glimmers of the twins were disappearing, the dancing binary stars themselves having fallen below the horizon of barren treetops. Dark would be on him soon. That information was mostly useless to him, just something to keep in mind as he dragged himself through the snow. Despite everything he'd experienced in this world so far, mystical beasts, a primordial forest populated by skyscraper trees out of myth, magical people, the mana in his own body, he'd never anticipated anything like the vision that had torn him from his body to see the world from space. Was it a dream, a hallucination born of the incredible stress of the moment? Possible, maybe even likely in part. Ulrich was a career skeptic. He believed in nothing that did not show evidence of itself, which was why he couldn't dismiss the entity that had crackled and branched, its arcing violet light spreading like a great tree itself, roots of lightning connecting the world to the empty vastness beyond the atmosphere. He could still feel it. Where his core used to beat with a hot, cold rhythm, now it hummed. The quiet force of its pulse reminded Ulrich of power lines, a feeling more than a sound of energy barely constrained. That thing was real, and Ulrich was tied to it by the threads of its power that he'd taken into himself. His core was now a mirror, well, more like a shard of a mirror larger than he could imagine, of that entity. Siran, the god of lightning and electrical force potential. Ulrich had seen the world through its ephemeral eyes just a moment, enough to nearly scour his mind empty and turn him into an elemental. Was it like that for every awakening? The elves had downplayed it then. Hard. Maybe to keep from scaring him shitless and making him fuck it up from sheer terror. The wreckage and ruin around his feet, when his mind returned, flashed into his mind's eye. Massive 100-meter trees turned into used matchsticks. Pools of glassed stone, still glowing, radiating the after effects of being touched by the attention of the prime elemental. If the Akashic record had pinged him in the middle of all that he hadn't noticed, he couldn't have noticed. You go see God and keep track of a little bell in your head. It took only a slight effort of will to call his own status before himself, and he viewed it with only a little trepidation. He saw the change immediately and couldn't be surprised. Honestly, he was a little teensy bit underwhelmed. Probably he shouldn't have been, though. It wasn't like a communion. His pitiful human conception had just brushed the entity above, and that incidental contact had been more than enough for him. Nobody ever mentioned that the elemental forces, the inflections of mana, had manifestations. Or was the correct word avatars? That thing had a will, an ego. It was inhuman, with nothing even approximating a mind as Ulrich knew it. But he'd felt clearly its desires, its instinct to cross distances untold, to connect all things. Ulrich laughed silently to himself as he plodded. He'd always wondered about that. What do you mean the electromagnetic wave is infinite range? Doesn't that mean it would fill all the universe? The answer, as it happened, was yes. Yes, it did, and it was happy about it. A shiver having nothing to do with the cold rolled up his spine. So close. Nothing is silent like a winter night. As the last light faded, the still air became stone-like. The only movement belonged to his own body. The only sound was his boots crunching on the snow. His thoughts spiraled as he tried to wrap them around what he'd seen and felt while in the grip of the mana. When the great living fortress reared up above him, the fortress named Irielhos, for that was the name of the heartwood from which it was created, Ulrich realized that he'd seen something similar to Charon before, though on a smaller scale. Irielhos, heart of the deep wood. There was a parallel. He'd been inside the core chamber of that ageless colossus. He'd felt of its mana, a warmth, a desire to grow, to be hale inside it. The tree was another greater than mortal existence. It wanted to protect the elves. It had spent its own vital energies to aid Baldurt, to help keep him from being consumed by the atrocity inside his body. Ulrich wondered how many of the Irielen knew that their fortress city was akin to a guardian deity. Maybe all of them. It was possible that Ulrich had been the last to figure it out. They played that kind of thing close to the chest. With good reason. No running around jumping for him, Ulrich was exhausted. He rode the lift up to the entryway to the lowest level of the city. From there, it was all a sightless blur, an impressionist painting on his every sense until he fell into his bed. He didn't feel the elf woman throw a blanket over him. Ulrich woke slowly. Otherworldly dreams of lightning faded from memory, evaporating as the frost beneath the twins. His eyes were opened, but the relief-carved ceiling had yet to take on a meaningful image. Gradually the impressions of a wild pond hidden in a deep forest depression and wild things coupled with the pond's waters filled his sight. Rise and shine. Sitting up, Ulrich looked around. The now familiar apartment 2.0 surrounded him comfortingly. Sylvan wonder in furniture form, tapestries woven to depict scenes across Orlithrum, all of it a splendor of incredible artistry, right down to the wood-turned water jug that showed him bees wandering across a field of flowers. Elves. Ulrich missed his window and balcony. Being able to rise with the twins and watch them ascend over the horizon had been a true joy. That had been ixnayed on account of he'd been one of the specific targets for assassination. The elves were determined to keep Ulrich alive out of sheer spite towards Prespang, if nothing else. Now it was an inner room with at least 3 layers of elven warriors around it. Ulrich didn't have a detachment of guards per se, It was just that anywhere he went, there tended to be a couple of pretty hard-looking elves hanging around like, maybe they wouldn't mind someone trying something stupid. He could live with it. Spend a few days having your meat scrubbed off and regrown, and the rest of you boiled, and you'll appreciate a couple of dudes chilling out in case something foul came a-knocking. Of Taipan he saw no trace, but a tray of food was on the table in the middle of the room, so she'd been around. It was probably later than he normally rose. Ulrich stripped out of his soiled garb, smelling of dried sweat, the earthy forest detritus, and, faintly, ozone. Naked, Ulrich took breakfast. He had not regained any of the modesty of the before. If anybody wanted to come inside his rooms unannounced, they were welcome to gaze upon his, formerly hairy ass. Now they would get to see what looked like some kind of dairy cow pattern of pale skin and deep tan, courtesy of Captain Firecracker. As Ulrich brought his breakfast sandwich to his mouth, his eyes caught a glimpse of himself in the mirror. The bread and meat slices scattered across the tabletop, falling freely from his deadened hands, forgotten. His scars were back. The Lichtenberg patterns of webbed tracery had run from the back of his neck, running down the outside of his left arm, down the side of his torso, terminating in his left heel, in the exact same orientation as in the before. He knew those scars intimately, had seen them every day for some 30 years. So, it would seem that not all of his out-of-body experience had been a hallucination. This was, strictly speaking, impossible. There was no realm of possibility in which the same exact path of current from two different lightning bolts could produce the same set of scars, which meant that somehow he hadn't been hit twice. He'd been hit once, in 2 lives. Now that's some magical fuckery for you. Siran was a being of connection. Maybe it had been offended by the thought of the same existence being separated by 2 worlds. Ulrich had to wonder how much of his life wasn't somehow a quantum anomaly. He was entangled at least for that one moment in time. Was this some kind of Watcher's shenanigans? Long had he been suspicious of the circumstances of his waking up in the Plateau of Ancience. Didn't matter. Ulrich stopped worrying about it. If the impossible wanted him here, then here he would be. If some godlike living sprite wanted to play a joke, then fine. At least he had a memento of his old life, no matter what else changed. Ulrich reformed his sandwich and downed breakfast. The affairs of immortals was cast out of his concerns. He had more pressing problems. Like how to explain to Taipan that she couldn't come with him when he went to Prosper. She wasn't going to like that. Not a bit. And Ulrich didn't know that there was anything he could actually do to stop her from simply following him around, probably without him even knowing she was out there if she chose to remain hidden. But Ulrich couldn't see a way around it. He couldn't take an Iriellen into the lands of the otherkin. He especially couldn't take the daughter of their mortal enemy, herself not a minor threat who had been reaping them for half a century. His strategy involved remaining incognito. He couldn't fight an army. If he could just blend into the rest of the populace, however, he wouldn't need to. Doing that with a living work of art like Taipan at his side would be more or less impossible as far as he could see. Maybe she'd see reason. I am your shadow, not your mother, Ulrich. I will break both of your legs if that is what it takes to keep you from killing yourself. Taipan's lovely, sultry voice whispered to him from across the short distance of water separating them in the baths. Yeah. That was about what he'd expected. He sighed and scrubbed his face with his hands, trying to push his stupid brain to think of some way to re-explain why, for the 100th time, it would be a catastrophically bad idea for her to travel with him into the heartlands of her generational enemies. Some overly optimistic fragment of his psyche, since banished to relive the most embarrassing social gaffes of his lifetime in penance, had honestly believed that this might be easy. Her initial smile of levity had been promising. Then she had realized that he wasn't trying to be amusing. And here they were. Ulrich took the threat under due advisement. She'd fucking do it. Searching the mist roiling through the baths for clues, he tried again to outline the situation. Look, we are both aware that there is no way a deep woods elf just strolls into Prosper. There is definitely no way that amongst all the Iriellen who walk this rock, that you will stroll into Prosper. If I am to be able to take a shot at the sons of bitches who are leading this war, I need to be able to blend in, go generally undetected, and not create a shitstorm by carrying around little Miss Black Rose, the Reaper of Pre-Spang, he said through clenched teeth. The damned elf had the nerve to look smug about those labels. They will no longer be able to turn their eyes into Orlathram Glade Chief. How will they know that I have even left Irielhos? I have cut my hair, and there are many other ways to alter my features, to be so different as to be indistinguishable from any other elf. I can alter my skin color to appear to be as pale as Lumitsite, or to have hair as crimson as Shore. Few there would be who even look twice at simply another Acer slave girl being towed along behind a barbarian from the outer reaches, she countered. Ulrich opened his mouth to tell her that was stupid. But was it? That braid was some kind of familial thing. It was unthinkable for her to cut it. Gaiat Iriel would never be seen without that braid. If she could alter her other features, who was to know that she wasn't still inside the fortress? Not like their enemy could just scry it anymore. Those holes in the magical protections of the Confederation were gone. Irielhos itself was thrice guarded. The fortress city had never been as thoroughly impregnable. Wait, had she just called him a barbarian? Focus, Ulrich. Not important. Okay, let's say you change your skin color and all the rest. How are you going to prevent some mage from doing some kind of screening for Irielen that neither of us know about? Surely someone, in the last couple of 100 years, has worried enough about being killed in their sleep by you or someone like you to think to put up wards and alarms, Ulrich reasoned. Delicate workings, as you describe, must be held or they fray apart. It would be literally maddening for a mage to attempt to hold on to it perpetually. A catalyst imbued to maintain so fine a warding would burn out in days, and even Prosper's merchant lords could not keep replacing them, Taipan countered. Her tone became grimmer as she further shot down his somewhat ad hoc resistance. Besides, it would be mostly useless given the numbers of my kin that Prosper enjoys using as slaves in their palaces, his shadow reasoned. We will have more trouble evading conventional sentries. No expense will be too great to keep their own hide safe. There will also be experienced warriors as guards and elite mercenaries, deep in their classes, hired. The cowards living in their iron walls in Prosper would hold them close, afraid for our counterstroke. Exactly the kind of counterstroke you are planning, which makes it a foolish idea in the first place. Taipan countered. Well, okay, she sort of had him there. I no more look as I did the last time they scried me as you do. I had hair then, and a beard, and now I have scars, totally different, down to the core. Ulrich defended himself. Indeed you do, Taipan said, taking him in. Have I mentioned before how fetching those scars are? Tracings of Siron etched into your flesh, the storm's dance itself. It is impressive. She purred, throwing him off. Maybe she had mentioned them. Maybe she'd come in shortly after he'd finished his breakfast, taken one look at him sitting there nude, and jumped his bones. Maybe she had. Gah! Get thee back, temptress. Ulrich ordered his lower half to stop stealing his brain. His lower half could not immediately comply. It was being encroached upon by her hands, causing him to jump and retreat into the deeper water of the great pool. Later, Taipan. Twins above. People are watching. Ulrich choked, warding her hands away before she started a battle she'd win, and stared mild outrage at her. More than a few smiles were glistening around the room, Cheshire cats marinating him in their attention. Irielen simply had not one fuck to give sometimes, and he never knew when that time had arrived. He suspected there were no rules, and they just did whatever they thought they could get away with, depending on nebulous social standings. Or whatever fucking elves. She sat back with a fake-ass pout on her lips. She was doing that to draw his attention to them. He was on to her games. That didn't make them work any less, just he was aware of them. Ever since she'd realized she could bypass approximately 40% of his mental defenses with her cleavage, she'd become a far more fearsome opponent. He wasn't sure what had gotten into her. Normally she was more reserved in public. For that matter, he still wasn't sure why she'd decided to start sleeping with him. He hadn't exactly parted with her on great terms before the attack. Something had changed in that period. She'd come to some kind of resolution. He was afraid to ask. It might be some kind of weird elf shit, and so long as he could pretend ignorance, he didn't have to wade into it. That didn't mean that he could leave things totally ambiguous, though. Ulrich had never been the type of person to take people's emotions for granted. It was too hard for him to make a connection for that to be possible. He had failed too many times to turn a budding relationship into something meaningful. There was a whole arse possibility that he was her booty call too. Ulrich was not a pretty man, but she was certainly a pretty gal. What if he was her way of slumming? He didn't mind that thought as much as he initially thought he would. Maybe later. God's blood later. For now, get your eyes off her and get your act together, man. Carefully finding a nice, harmless stretch of water, Ulrich continued trying to convince his shadow why her going with him was not going to work, and furthermore, that he wouldn't let her do it. They toweled off, heat-soaked flesh relaxed and clean. Chapter 97. You Don't Say. His negotiating prowess had paid solid dividends. Taipan would do exactly as she wanted to do, and there was nothing he could do about it. Additionally, she had revealed to him that she had a vial of some pinkish sludge that when he'd voiced his suspicions, she confirmed proudly was the reagents necessary for her hunter's mark ritual to be able to locate him anywhere he ran. Cough all of the reagents. Just keep that in your belt pouch then, do you? He'd questioned with some irritability. Yes. The other 3 identical vials I keep elsewhere, Glade Chief. You will not find them. But I will find you wherever you go. I wish you to remember that, whenever idiot notions of leaving me behind roam through that worm-eaten slush you keep inside your skull. Remember also what I will do to you when I catch you, Ulrich. She'd threatened, smiling. It was not a good smile, not a friendly thing at all, more a baring of fangs, intended to let the prey know that its final destination was upon it. She was every inch her namesake when she smiled like that. Cold, calculating, vicious, and capable of immense harm without hesitation. Ulrich had a feeling that smile was the last sight of many an enemy dying at her feet. Fine, fine, I said, you win. I'll find some way to convince you how awful an idea it is for you to accompany me. He gave ground. Maybe your parents will have some way to put you to rights. That last was muttered, a half-thought. Mother Veda fetched Father Baldert from Prosper when he lost his mind and drug him back, paralyzed from the neck down by broadleaf yellow star poison. She did not allow him to move from his rooms for 3 months, until he swore he would never do so without her again, and only with the full strength of Iriel at his back. Who is it you think I take after more, Ulrich? My powerful jester of a father, or the heartwood spear of Iriel? Taipan asked rhetorically. He didn't bother answering, they both knew. Back in the new apartment, Taipan told him that Instructor Gotha was ready to receive them at the normal time and place, if Ulrich was up to it. Ulrich looked at her with surprise writ full across him. She must have gone out before he awoke to tell Gotha Ulrich hadn't exploded or gone elemental, the 2 most common fates of a failed awakening. Oh, thanks, Taipan. Okay, yeah, I've got questions. I know we haven't talked about what happened out there, but I've still sort of not gotten my head all the way around it. Maybe the 2 of you will be able to tell me if I'm just off my rocker, Ulrich said, his voice going distant as he thought about the events on the forest bluff. This rocker of yours lies on the bottom of the deepest trench of the deepest Svertalfin mine. So long lost, you will sooner find the heart of a dungeon than rumor of it. He was informed by his shadow. Harpy, he libeled her in return, addled Drake. She bantered. He was certain she'd made that last thing up, and so declared himself the winner. Not that it mattered. Certainly it wouldn't be the case that he had a long-running mental tally of the results of their verbal spars. A mental cross went across a set of 4 imagined chalk marks to indicate a 5th victory. He'd count the rest up later. Anyway, he was stalling. Time to go talk to the old mage and see what he'd done to himself. Easy silence followed them through the halls, pavilions and walkways of Irielhos. The clangon and clamour of elves were mere background noise now, barely registering to him. Truly, a guy can adapt to about anything given enough time. Ulrich held his questions. Taipan had previously demonstrated enough lack of interest or particular wisdom on the matter of magery to render herself immune to his questions. If he wanted to know how to set an ambush for otherkin, or how to deceive a pack of shadow wolves into taking poison, Taipan was your one-stop shop for volumes of knowledge. As soon as he veered away from that, however, he was swiftly buried in non-committal shrugs and "I have heard it so's." Best to see a mage about magic. In a few minutes, the twirling suns having crossed well past their zenith, Ulrich found himself once more standing on the amphitheatre floor with one instructor Gotha, eldest Acer of the Eerie Ellen. The old elf stroked his beard as Ulrich descended the stairs, murmuring who knows what elf gobbledygook. As Ulrich presented himself respectfully, awaiting the elder elf to have first say, a courtesy of the Eerie Ellen he'd come to adopt in his months of training, the archmage looked him over with sharp gold and green-flecked eyes, bushy brows drawn down in study. You are not a changeling, nor an elemental. I can smell no sign that your core will undergo supercritical resonance and annihilate you where you stand, killing us all. Then it seems against all odds that you have lived. Good. I am always disappointed when a promising student scatters himself across the forest, Gotha said without inflection. If Ulrich thought he had a dry sense of humor, Gotha was the unmatched Atacama of wits. At no point had Ulrich conclusively determined that the wizened elf had made a joke, but some of his statements were a little too on the nose to be accidental. Soldiering on, Ulrich had to accept that all of those listed possibilities were real events, not contrived for the sake of entertainment. Damn, they had completely undersold the whole awakening event. Ulrich figured now was the time to just go in feet first. I don't want to alarm anybody, but I think I met God. One of them anyway, he blurted. Two pairs of fine elven eyebrows rose, though none spoke. I went through the process, as Shaw explained it to me, and as Bathe and Vedir instructed. Cycling my mana, attuning the my core as purely to the lightning mana as I could, as wholly Seraon as I was able, and then began to infuse my flesh, purging the unexpected energies. As this progressed, more or less as described, I began to build my isolation shell of Seraon. At that point, some real fucked up stuff started to occur around me, Ulrich recounted. First of all, the unexpected mana inside my body snapped into attunement with the rest, in a way that's never happened. I always had to sort of force it along, massage it into the right wavelength. Not then. As soon as the shell started to come to completion, boom, the internalized wild mana phased in with the mana I was holding in my core, he continued, noting an appearance of concern on Gotha's features and confusion on Taipan's. So, that part was atypical after all. Neither said anything though, so Ulrich moved on to the spooky bit. As the shell solidified, so did all the purged mana, and I was sitting in a pool of pure Saran. Sometime in there, a storm gathered out of nothing in frigid winter, and lightning started firing between clouds and falling to the ground around me. Something with sentience reached out of that chaos and grabbed me. I felt, or saw, or imagined something, a massive bolt of lightning carry me into the sky, beyond the sky, and there I saw a massive being of pure mana sitting in space. Gotha was now in shock, and Taipan seemed convinced that Ulrich had been hitting the morphinator again. Nothing for it now, he had to finish. We called them sprites on my world, manifestations of the solar wind colliding with the electromagnetic field of our planet. It looked similar, but that thing was aware. It tried to connect with me, some part of it wanted to, I don't know, save me or help me or something, only it didn't know how. All it wanted was to connect everyone to everything, to everywhere. It was, I don't know, as if it didn't want anyone to be alone. I almost went with it, but held to myself, and it let go. When I gained awareness of myself again, the entire area was a lightning-ravaged wasteland, and my shell was totally gone. My core was also awakened, and I swear to you now, I can still feel that whatever the fuck it was up there, waiting. I think it's Saron. You know, like, all of it, Ulrich said, losing his concern for being potentially insane. At this point, he just needed to know what he'd seen up there. If it was a delusion born of temporary nuttiness, he was totally okay with that. If it wasn't, he had to reorganize how he thought of the upper limits of what he considered possible. His quote of Shakespeare to Taipan so long ago rang ironically in his head. More in heaven and earth indeed. It was Gotha who eventually broke the spell. He was as severe and serious as Ulrich had ever seen him. What you have just told me, you should never tell another soul as long as you live, Ulrich. No one. Ever. There are debates thousands of years old on the natures of the elements, of the gods and their forms. If some of the orders and cults that occupy Svartalfheim hear what you have described, they would kill you, either for blasphemy or to raise you as a saint of their order. There are writings a bare handful of the most ancient and learned Aesir and Svartalfin, myself included, can read. They describe the existence of prime elementals, gods, who are the desires and will of the elements made whole. The wizard said grimly, "Few there are who ever make contact with them, not and remain whole. I believe your contact with the eternal gaze put a sort of safety net around you, a buffer of its own will, else you'd have been consumed. None who awaken experience this thing, though. This is a matter for archmages," he continued, still not quite believing. "It is that freakish thing inside you, that God-touched core. Never should you have had so much raw mana sitting around inside you. When you awakened it, you pulled so greatly on its energies that you called Seron, the Prime, you held its attention for a moment. Catkin are said to have 12 lives, but you have burned through a score of them to be here now," finished Gotha in a stunned whisper. That was enough to properly scare a former professional geek into submission. Meeting a god went right into his tell-no-one box with a nice fat padlock to see it buried in his subconscious. "Then I'm not crazy," Ulrich checked. "Oh, you're crazier than 9 berserker hornets in a jar of Evernight sap." Gotha the Wise told him in the first break of that elf's composure that Ulrich had witnessed. "But you aren't delusional, and that is better than you are allowed to ask for Glade Chief," concluded the wizard more calmly. Ulrich rubbed his temples at that judgment. Whatever happened to his dreams of living in a shack in the woods? How did this turn into some kind of trip down the Odyssey? It hadn't worked out so very damned well for Ulysses, and Ulrich wasn't geared for this kind of god shit. Terrestrial nonsense was already doing a number on him. "Focus, Einar, what of this can you use?" All right, before my shadow explodes from holding herself in," Ulrich began, directing a pointed stare at the ever-so-slightly shaking form of his beautiful huntress bodyguard. "What does this mean for the awakening process? Did it work? Is the crisis over now?" he asked, stressing that last part. He dearly needed to check off some crisis boxes. The bearded elf nodded simply at that, giving Ulrich some good news at last. "The awakening is complete. You will not kill yourself from mana resonance now. Later, it is within the realm of possibility that you are disintegrated by Serion's direct touch. But such is the eventual fate of all archmages. I myself cannot draw on my reserves too greatly, or Daendro will make a statue of me, or perhaps a sapling of the heartwood if I am worthy." "Does that happen to everyone, this elementalization?" Ulrich asked. A definitive cutting motion of the wide-sleeved arm killed that notion. "Absolutely not. Most mages never come close to the root of their powers. Even weavers, masters of their art, are mostly too distant from the truth of things to find the attention of the primes. It is possible that those classes that are ultimately refined may come close to it, but I have not witnessed it or been handed evidence sufficient to convince me that it has happened. Those classed so are all too grounded in reality to properly lose themselves to the substrate of existence. Finding a root anchor in your classes is virtually the only way to imprint oneself into the world, in such a way as to prevent your eventual annihilation," explained Gotha, as if that clarified anything. He'd lost Ulrich about halfway through that, but Ulrich had firmly decided not to probe any more into it. Every time the old elf spoke, he added existential horror to Ulrich's life. "All Rioite then. Sorry I asked, a bit. What's changed for me? How does this process, impending doom aside, alter how I use magic or manipulate my core?" Ulrich asked, trying to get this conversation onto a useful track. "Finally, a pertinent question," commented his shadow from the side. "You know what, Taipan?" Ulrich bit back a retort. "Focus. She's decided to fuck with you now. Probably comeuppance for the plan to leave her behind. Deal with her later." Even Gotha glanced at her, a not-so-subtle suggestion for her to butt out if she wasn't going to contribute. Ulrich resisted the absolutely inane urge to offer the skeletal archmage a high five. "Let us find out directly, Ulrich," suggested Gotha, raising his hand and a 3-meter-tall pillar of solid wood from the floor that fairly radiated strength. "Now that your core is attuned to Seraon, I am assuming, that is the native form of your mana." This does not mean that you are limited only to this one mana form, a failing of many adepts. Just because you are now stronger and swifter in the use of this mana, you should not neglect the use of others. You mentioned that Shaw taught you to oscillate through mana forms. This is a good thing. Let me first show you a practice methodology for relearning how to do so. Now that your mana is naturally attuned, you will need to go through the process of unattuning it, reverting it back into the raw waveform to be shaped anew to whatever purpose you need. Lectured Gotha, back in his element. Attend. Damn it, things always got difficult when they said that. True to form, a gaseous sphere of greenish-brown mana solidified into what appeared to be a billiard ball of oak. The ball dissolved to become an enormous water droplet, and again to form a shard of ice, a ball of blue flame, a globe of lightning. Gotha transmuted the mana from one form to the others, 7 elemental forms, and not a drop of sweat on his brow. From there, the old Archmage displayed, instead of something merely incredibly difficult, an act that was nearly impossible. The globe of mana became 7 smaller globes, each spinning in a large circle. As they crossed before the golden irises, flecks of emerald catching the light, they became one of each of the previous elemental forms until he had all 7 orbiting in a circle before him. The first exercise you will begin immediately, refining your mana to unaspected and then reattuning it so smoothly that the reversion to raw form is without pause. It is critical that you learn to do this quickly, or you will struggle to use most of your powers in an actual combat and become one of those failed adepts, cripples who will never become weavers, let alone archmages. Spoke Gotha with a deep contempt of any who would not seek to master this basic manipulation of their own mana. And the second, Ulrich prompted, perhaps unnecessarily. He could tell the old boy was having him on a bit now. You'll pick it up in a century or two, answered the elf dryly,